Hello world. I do not really know how to start this one. This is a weird moment and also a weird podcast. So I'm just gonna drink this wine here. So I'm recording this at 10 p.m. I got a flight in the morning to Texas for the Solar Eclipse Festival, where I'm going to be getting married. And this is like a crazy day. Our travel plans that we have booked for 3 months for this eclipse got massively fucked with when the owner of the RV we rented just canceled on us. Basically, apparently there's this thing going on where there's a high demand for all kinds of services due to the eclipse. And so people are just fucking everyone over because the demand is so high. So they're canceling on people. And then there's obviously high demand. So anyone will just pay like insane prices. So it's people have an incentive to cancel on people who have already, booked, so that they can make more money. This is like capitalism 101. So this is like one of the many faces of Moloch. But anyways, not here to be a victim. I'm just saying that's like the day I've had. It's interesting. And I just felt, because I had some wine and haven't had a wine in a long time. So I'm chilling more of like a rambly sort of talkative mode instead of being all directly to the point. But to the point, I did a podcast with this guy, Mark McCormack, who you haven't heard of him probably because he's not famous, but he is an interesting fellow. It's a very interesting fellow. He lives in Canada. I stumbled upon him in a weird, obscure part of the internet in a chat room called Vibe Cafe, which is basically just like a place that, you can like Zoom chat with people. It's not a Zoom, but like you can drop in video calls with people kind of anytime. So it's like a digital hangout, cafe space. And there's actually some really cool conversations going on there. There's some really cool corners of the internet in the sort of liminal web, regenerative space, whatever you want to call it, meta-modern space, etc. And met this dude Mark in a group call with these, my friend invited me to, and had a good conversation, and then had another call with them, and I was like, okay, this guy's got some interesting ideas. I'd love to talk to him, so we scheduled a podcast. And his whole thing is Hegel. He's got a lot of love for Hegel. There's a philosopher that, a German philosopher that lived, I think in the 1800s. And according to Mark, revolutionized philosophy and was way ahead of his time. And I think he's onto something. I think Hegel was onto something for sure. And the main sort of idea that I took away in this conversation is like about the Hegelian dialectic, which is something that I've already been into for a while. It's just the idea that, you could have the thesis or the point that one side is making, the antithesis or the opposite side, right? The contrast, and then the synthesis, right? The thing that emerges from the two together. So this is what Hegel calls sublation, and it's essentially just like what we're really after is the third thing, the synthesis. It's the thing that takes the idea, negates it, and then actually subweights it or transcends it. It includes and transcends. We get this synthesis. So that was a lot of what we talked about, but Mark's got some pretty wild ideas about universal logic and, Hegelianism in general. He's got this project called New World Spirit. He's currently on like day 14 or something of a 28-day fast. So he's on like a hunger strike right now. at the university. He lives in Edmonton, and he's hunger striking at the University of Alberta uh, for the mega crisis, as he calls it. And somehow I think thinks that not eating for 28 days is helping. And maybe it is, but regardless, it's like a fascinating thing to do a 28-day fast. I think that, anyone who's doing that, you're leading a type of consciousness. You're going into a place that many people never go, like most people never go. I've just done only a week-long fast, and that changed my state dramatically. Can't imagine what 4 times that, and obviously you're just hitting different levels. So props to you, Mark, for doing the fast, regardless of whether it's for a good cause or not. Or it is for a good cause, it seems like. Whether it's going to make a difference or not, that's what I meant to say. Just having the determination to do that is pretty wild. So anyways, this is a conversation with Mark Performance. And I'll just leave it up to you to determine what the signal is, to sort the signal from the noise and see what you think about his ideas. But I figured I'd publish this, and before I go on this trip to Texas, this was like dangerously close to me missing my commitment of weekly podcasts on Saturdays. So this is me recording at 10 p.m. in the dim light with wine in my system after a whirlwind of a day. And so excuse me for the shit structure on this intro. And also, we didn't have the best quality either in this conversation because Mark couldn't get Riverside to work on his computer. So we ended up recording in Zoom, which is a little bit lower fidelity. So apologies for that. And anyways, next time I check in with you, I will be married on Profit. So much love.
Cool. All right, Mark. So, I am curious what it is you've been up to in the sense of we met in a weird little niche corner of the universe of the internet verse, webverse, and you've been rapping about some stuff that I find quite intriguing. But I also find hard to wrap my head around and also hard to articulate. So something along the lines of kind of a Hegelian universal sort of logic that seems to be applicable to, well, universally. So, seems to have big implications for sort of the meta crisis, meaning crisis, and sort of the moment that we're in. And I want to get your sort of high level take on that, and then we can kind of drill down on it, and so I can try to understand it on a deeper level. But before we unpack it, I'm curious, just for myself and for any listeners, to try to contextualize it a little bit. How did you arrive to where you're at now? If you could just paint with broad strokes the story of sort of, the journey into kind of this philosophy and, diving down into Hegel and whatnot. And then maybe we can also sort of frame it up a little bit with some context of Hegel, and then maybe dive deeper in, you know what I mean? Or feel free to take any route you want to take. These are sort of where my thoughts are at. And so I'm finding like I need some more scaffolding, I think, to sort of contextualize and then unpack what we're going to talk about.
Deep breath. First of all, how did I end up looking homeless might be a great place to start. I'm looking a little unkempt. Maybe we shouldn't release the video version of this and we just have the voice stream. But if you're looking at me right now, if this is a video, I'm preparing for a hunger strike is sort of how I'm coming to this meeting, in this interview, this debate, this whatever this turns out to be, this synchronicity. which is quite intense. It's going to be about a 4-week hunger strike, because what's happening requires a very high level of wisdom, I believe, to solve. And yes, this is where the Hegel stuff comes in. I'm intentionally representing where I feel like the real median of society is at. So right now, if you're dressed in all the best accoutrements, all the best designers have all the best of the world, and it's not explicitly ethically labeled, then it's probably in some sense predicated on slavery. Because at the moment, our global system is shaking, it is teetering. We have exchanges of global hegemony happening. We have almost every area of society is changing more rapidly than even our greatest futurists thought. And so to interface with this problem, this reality that I'm finding myself in, I'm externally representing it, but internally I'm representing something else. And it's representing this universal logic. And this universal logic might sound strange to ordinary, I would say, consciousness, but maybe to your audience, Christian, will make maybe a little bit more sense, because you're sort of more in this philosophical space, primed with John Vervaeke, I saw. You have Forrest Landry, some really hardcore metaphysicians. And in some sense, to me, philosophy is about that, is about hardcore metaphysics, which is what the universal logic is. But it's also practical. All these contradictions that we find in reality or in our conceptual apparatus come into play when we're trying to interpret the world and make meaning. And I feel like this inner meaning and this outer meaning are also in contradiction right now. And this universal logic brings them together in a deeper kind of philosophy called genuine philosophy. And genuine philosophy is about resolving at least 200 of these universal contradictions in a flowing organic whole that circles back on itself and completes itself and is clear and is robust and coherent and consistent. In fact, it's super coherent is what we call it. And it's also, genuine philosophy is also not just theoretical, it's also practical. You're supposed to be it while you're thinking it. It's ontological and epistemological. So hopefully, if you're as hardcore as I feel like your community might be, Christian, that hopefully tickles a few fancies. But really, I'm just out here trying to change what I can with hunger strikes and trying to get my style back together while being on the edge of poverty, trying to mediate all these tensions and existential threats. So that's a little bit of the introduction of how I got here practically. And then the whole Hegel story, that was 18 years in the making. It took me 18 years to find the Hegel stuff. And I hope people don't write me off like right now. It's like, oh, a Hegelian, and all these Hegelian stereotypes come in and say, okay, turn off the interview. We know what he's going to say. There might be something new here. In fact, I actually know there is, because no one's interpreted Hegel this way before. So I wonder, that sets a little bit of the context. Where do you want me to drill in from here? Start with my childhood, go, or just like, no, why are you
okay. A couple quick caveats. One is that I don't know how hardcore I am. I would definitely self-identify as very curious. So, but I'm also pretty green in the way of like formal training in, say, philosophy or something like that. And I agree with you. I think that philosophy is supposed to be practical, and it's supposed to actually be about embodying wisdom. And it should be, you know, how you live your life, not necessarily how you speak about abstract ideas. However, I do see that, you know, drilling down on the ideas and getting coming as close to reality as possible and understanding sort of the nature of it is very useful, right? And it's helpful in and just navigating reality. Obviously, you want to have a better sense of what you're navigating and have a better map. So I'm trying to create a better map for myself, but I'm also not trying to mistake the map for the territory, which is what I see a lot of in not just philosophy, but just like people people's articulations, like, you know, our narratives, our stories of reality, of whether it's through sort of a religion or a metaphysics, some other philosophy, or whether it's an ideology around an economy, like an economic doctrine, or whatever it is. It's like people seem to get lost in the sauce of the map and they lose the territory, right? So I'm just being mindful of that. And so I'm also, just to give you a little bit of context about me, because it might be useful as well. I grew up in a very small, tight-knit, fundamentalist Mormon community. So I grew up in a polygamous society with um, a very just sort of like echo chambery type worldview, right? That was very specific. Everyone kind of synced up on the same story, very similar story. And so after leaving that, I became somewhat allergic to any sort of universal story that's just going to be the sort of fix or the key. Do you see what I mean? So I've got some skepticism around this idea that any sort of one story is the story, but I do see value in a unifying story of value. So I'm sure you're familiar with Mark Gaffney and Zach Stein and Cosmoerotic Humanism. They just released a book under a pseudonym that's called First Principles and First Values, and I've been reading that, and it's quite beautiful and quite articulate, and just it resonates a lot, this idea that there is first values, that there are sort of like fundamental meaning and purpose to the universe, and that having that shared story, that shared narrative of value is going to be in some sense necessary to address the meaning crisis and meta crisis, because it is emergent. Those crises emerge from our breakdown of common ground and the separation paradigm that we're in. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into how I'm approaching the conversation. And I'm curious, like, how you arrived, like what was your sort of arc of experience, study, whatever, that took you into this place where you're now sort of like trying to pioneer this Hegelian universal story of logic of value. I don't know how you would characterize it, but I'll leave it up to you to do that.
To try. There's a contradiction in your story, right? No pun intended, between being allergic to these universal narratives, but also seeing value in them. And I think John Vervaeke and Forrest Landry and the meta-modern guys, particularly, since it's based a lot on art and ritual, and all these guys are in that mode because it does have functional value, especially in philosophy, when normally they seem to be somewhat separate, even though philosophy seems to be universal. It seems to be everywhere. We give PhDs, doctorates of philosophy, to the highest in any field. And I agree with you that this universality is a key component of it. Mormonism is something that I studied a little bit. And there's a channel online where like there's a bunch of escaping Mormons now. There's a whole channel for like if you're escaping, there's like a whole community to embrace you, because all these previous modes of expression, which are religious, were what held humanity together for thousands of years. And it created that cultural cohesion rather than this chaos that seems to be enveloping our species. So a lot of people said, well, it worked in the past, and even though it was a control mechanism, we all know that religion in some sense was about control, especially with the Holy Roman Empire and using Christianity as a sort of societal control structure. But we're missing one now. It's like all of these religious modes are losing their power because science is rising to such incredible heights that it's starting to seem godly. Right? Like the technologies we're releasing really seem like we are becoming gods ourselves, and we are the masters of our own destinies, captain of our souls. And so it's questioning, these narratives of, well, did we just make up these stories, to make ourselves feel good in this existential void that we're in? And it's really impacting people. Even though 85% of the world still identifies as religious, it's still not releasing a kind of spirit or culture that's solving this, what I'm calling the mega crisis. It's not the best word, but it's encompassing, I think, a clear understanding of what the problem really is. And of course, asking the right questions and identifying the problem is half the solution. And so the mega crisis is a combination of the meta crisis simultaneously with the poly crisis. And when I was listening to
Can you identify the distinction of and just maybe define those for people?
Yes. Well, it's interesting because the podcast you sent to me right before this was that it was a really hardcore podcast.
Yeah, it was.
In modern modernism, right? It's pretty much the most hardcore. It was like the top dogs, like going at it, and they're so good at metacognition that they didn't fight like normal lower levels of cognition do. They actually tried to, what we call in Hegelian philosophy, they tried to sublate. They tried to find a win-win-win because they already know that game theory and decision theory results in zero-sum games that are not fun, right? So it's like within their philosophies is this dynamic where like the process itself is part of the problem. So it was really wonderful to listen to the first half of it. I got interrupted. But in the beginning, it was useful because it's a great kind of segue into the Hegelian stuff and my history with it and where your history is with it and these different modes of how to move together, whether it's religion or art or science or philosophy. Because right at the beginning of the interview, John Vervaeke is asked to define the meaning crisis. And so right away we think, well, what's the difference between the meaning crisis and the meta crisis? And now we have this mega crisis and a poly crisis. And it's like, is anybody even clear what the problem really is? And he's like, we have big chunks of the problem, but it's like we're not coherent enough on it to create solutions. And my intuition is saying I could bring in Daniel Smachtenberger here, who I've been really trying to get on board with this sort of Hegelian perspective, because I was put in touch with him about 2 years ago from a friend who said, you really have to talk to this guy. This guy's a genius. He'll understand what you're saying, because there was a podcast where he's mentioning Hegel right away. And I thought, wow, that's really rare. So that was the first time I learned about metamodernism and Daniel's crew. And he's not necessarily associated with metamodernism, but he hangs out in those circles with John and Forrest Landry. But these three guys are like really, gifted intellectually, analytically, and can do the theory, metaphysical stuff and try and blend it with like the practical ritual stuff. They're trying to sublate all these contradictions.
Real quick, I just want to unpack what you're saying there, because for the audience and for myself, when you say sublate, you're talking, it's a Hegelian term, and you're talking about sort of this dialectic, which, if I understand it correctly, is, level one would be the thesis, right? Would be like the claim or the idea. Level two would be the antithesis, or the kind of opposite polarity, the other thing pushing back. And then the third level up is sort of the higher level truth, or the synthesis that emerges from the thesis and the antithesis. And this is sort of, what John Vervaeke's been trying to pioneer with, or trying to kind of this renaissance of dialogue with the dialogos kind of practices that he's been, and him and Forrest were talking about that in the second half of the conversation at length. They talk about this whole dialectical process, which is why I wanted to send you that conversation, because I feel like that is what is really required, is the synthesis. Like where we're at right now is we've kind of reached peak separation. We're not just from humans and the environment and us from alienated from each other, but it's like the specialization and everything's just going so separate that the synthesis is really we've diverged. Now we need the convergence, right? And I think that there's a really helpful frame there with the Hegelian dialectical model. So anyways, go on.
What you just did there to add clarity to the conversation was you used what's called the method of the notion, because you identified a root contradiction there that's causing a separateness in the conversation. And it was between, if you caught it just now, any of the listeners, it was between convergence and divergence, right? These opposites seem to be in reality, and this is what dialectic is. It's what Hegel calls the negative moment of reason. And if we dive in too quickly here, we'll really lose people like remarkably fast, because the ordinary words that we use have way different meanings than we are normally used to. So the way that you're going to start noticing I'm using the words, and then maybe you, Christian, will start using them too, it'll have a resonance with your ordinary colloquial use of the terms, but underneath, the logic that I'm using now is much clearer. It's different. This is the Hegel stuff. And it allows you to recognize contradictions in what is what we call incomplete opposition. Incomplete opposition, perspectives of incomplete opposition, is what we call diversity, where you have a bunch of objects around you, but they don't necessarily seem connected in any kind of harmony or order or anything. It's kind of like contingent. And contingent is just a way to say there's a kind of randomness to it, or kind of like caprice to it. Like you get to choose on whatever you focus on. There's not like something necessary has to happen. And I feel like what you just did there is you kind of cut through the noise of this diversity, and you saw there's like an essence to the conversation, where there's these tensions at play that we need to resolve because it seems to be harming us. All this information that we have is not wisdom. And even Vervaeke was saying this in the other podcast. Particular knowledge, technical knowledge, is exploding right now. So we don't need more of that. It's like doubling every 6 months now or whatever it is. And we're literally drowning in it. We need artificial intelligence just to keep up with the cutting edge developments in AI. So what do we need here is a certain type of knowledge. And this certain type of knowledge is called wisdom, but it operates by this contradictory, seeing the world in these dialectics, but not stopping at dialectics. What you have to do is learn the next step of what's called universal logic. And anything that's seen clearly in the world is of this three-sidedness of any universal notion. So now, just to talk about, I have to introduce a few more terms, but they flow into each other. And what flows out of this is that universal logic has an abstract understanding moment, a negative moment of reason moment, and then a positive moment of reason moment or side. So anything that is complete, which means clear, has to have those three in the right context, which requires origin and order. And before all this Hegel stuff, I never thought about it this way either, but it makes a lot more sense for the sense making.
Does this map onto being, non-being, becoming?
So yes, so this is where it gets more practical, which is what Vervaeke and Forrest Landry and everybody in the world's trying to do. And if you read Hegel the wrong way, you don't get to the practical use of how simple his method is. But when you grasp it, you start to see these oppositions in reality in their what's called the conditional form. Like you see the conditions that allow for freedom within bounds, but those bounds are eternal, meaning that they're true. They're not just correct. Truth and correctness is also a hyper nuance that we're not normally used to making. So that's why I'm very careful. I've tried to teach this now for like 2 years, and it's even the high level guys like Forrest Landry and John Vervaeke, and it's, you know, as soon as you start getting into it, universes of meaning start to open up. Universes, conceptual, the inward world is enormous, and the internet is actually causing that to expand, which is causing this separation you were talking about, where we seem to be diverging instead of converging. But now everybody in the sort of social justice, the world where it's like, okay, something's wrong, I want to do something. The activists are scared of or concerned about convergence. They're saying, well, divergence is a good thing. Michel Foucault, diversity, expression, democracy. Yeah. So as soon as you start saying, well, we need to have a convergence, you start getting into that religious cultism. It's like, oh, we're all going to end up in a totalitarian cult. And now we're talking about Hegel. Oh my goodness, he's the fascist dictator, Mussolini. And it starts like all these stereotypes come into play, which is why I avoided Hegel for 18. Well, I found out about Hegel when I was 13 in a book called Sophie's World. And I didn't like him at all. In Sophie's World, I think they cover like 30, 40 philosophers or something like this. And he didn't stand out. In fact, he seemed to be the problem, obscuring philosophy and making it less wise by playing all these mind games and making himself sound smart. And 18 years later now, I found that it's the exact opposite. He's so clear that to ordinary consciousness, he looks backwards. And that backwardsness is why we interpret convergence the wrong way, and we avoid it when we really do need it. We're too one-sided in the divergence. Now we do need a convergence, but not the wrong way. The way is actually what makes all the difference, not the one-sidednesses. If you try and get rid of one of the dialectical sides, it turns into indeterminacy. It turns into a sort of kind of chaos, and you can't grapple with it either. So you're even more ungrounded. And that's where we're kind of going. We're like, okay, the structure we have is wrong. So we're destroying it, negating it, but we're not replacing it with anything better. So we're going to end up in this sort of psychosis, basically this complete irrationality, where the wrong tangles of everything. Everything will be present, but in the wrong way. And that's where you start getting into these double binds, which is the root of oppression.
It makes a lot of sense to intuitively to me. Well, at first it's not intuitive. At first, my intuition was very much in this sort of yes, no, binary, black, white world, good, bad, good, evil type of thing, which, is woven into, the story that I grew up with and the worldview I was entrenched in. But, through like diving deeper into expanding out beyond that and finding philosophers like Alan Watts and Eastern mysticism, and sort of the, starting to recognize the inherent polarity that is one of the universal laws of cosmos. It seems like the universe is polar. Like there's this sort of yin yang opposites sort of dance together, and they only exist in definition of each other. Like they need each other to even exist, right? So if I was to say, like, you pointed out that you have these sort of this diversity, and they don't seem related, and they seem almost chaotic. And like you could look at fire on one hand and ice on the other, and be like, there's no relationship. They're opposite. They're very different, but they're unified in the field of temperature. You know what I mean? Like
Mm.
they're different degrees of the same thing. When I'm looking at it through that lens, right? So I think what we're dealing with here is like, um, well, we pointed to already, but we need the synthesis, because where we're at right now is that binary separation sort of worldview is actually existential. Like it leads to it's the self-terminating system, right? And it's the arms race, essentially. Like that's kind of at the bottom of all of it. And so what is the and I don't think it needs to be through one particular lineage or language or story. It could be many-faced, right? Like you can have, for example, yin and yang and Taoism, and also at the same time, like, so that's like sort of the opposites coming together in synthesis, but at the same time, the Tao that could be named is not the eternal Tao. So it's like, as soon as you start to bring it down into the language, and you say this is what it is, you're by definition mistaking the finger for the moon. You know what I mean? You're pointing to the words, and you get lost in the thing. So what we're doing, I think, is quite, there's a paradox, right? Which is like, on the one hand, it's impossible, seems like to me, impossible um, to language any of this. Because by definition, your point, the words are the shadow of the thing that they're pointing to, right? They're a lower dimensional form, or they're a lower dimension of the higher dimensional ideal or form or whatever. And then, but on the other hand, it's like, if we have to we have to come to this synthesis, um because like there's the mega crisis, as you say, right? So it's like, it looks like the obstacle is the way, we're almost forced into this convergence, and synthesis. It's time to start synthesizing and weaving and bringing things together. Like there's this beautiful prophecy of in the Amazon of the eagle and the condor, which is, these two birds of prey, these two amazing uh, birds that are like apex predators, basically. And the eagle is representative of the people of the mind, the people of reason, of rationality, of technology. And they symbolize, so basically the story, the prophecy is that these peoples diverged in the mists of history in the distant past, and the eagle peoples took the path of the mind, and the condor peoples took the path of the heart, the path of nature, the path of the medicines. And it was prophesied that, that the eagle people would almost completely eradicate the condor people. And they actually did when Columbus made contact with the Americas, right? Like we almost completely eradicated the condor peoples, and uh and kind of darkly and poetically almost eradicated the condors themselves. And and then the final sort of leg of the prophecy is that there would be a time when the both birds, the eagle and the condor peoples, would fly together in the same sky and give birth to higher consciousness. And that's the synthesis, right? So it's like the separation, and then coming back together, and the synthesis. Because when you allow the separation, then when you come back together, there's a new thing that emerges that's a higher form that could have ever happened if the separation would have never occurred.
Yeah, has potential. That's right. There's many doors open right now, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, this is what I hope would happen because it's going to show that this universal logic really is the way forward. And it's a great platform to show that it answers a lot of these questions. So right now we have probably 5 or 6 big threads open where people who are in ordinary consciousness will see an abstraction and they'll start to polarize, say, this guy doesn't have it. No. It's too open. Unless there's somebody who really understands dialectics and has that synthetic cognition, hopefully they're creating space right now to allow the other sides to come in. So one of them is, we didn't finish defining the problem with John Vervaeke, right? He said the meaning crisis. Well, what's the difference between meaning crisis and the meta crisis? And now we're opening this box towards, okay, what is the synthesis? And then what is the way? And is there a way to the synthesis? And we have to go back to the convergence versus the divergence. And then back to like Mormonism and culture and stories. And how do you resolve this contradiction between having a unitive story and then, not having a cult? And like, we got a lot of doors open right now. And then I mentioned double binds on top of that. All these things in my mind right now, the way that I see universal logic is like diversity. We're in the mode of diversity in complete opposition. So to start using the way of universal logic to tighten this up, you have to do it in the synthetic way you're talking about. You do have to make it into triads, but there's a way to the triads that you can do it wrong. So even the triads are, in some kind of scientific sense, but also a mystical sense, also in opposite ways. So if you do them in the inverted way from their truth, then you end up abstracting reality and breaking it into these horrifically boring chunks of what he calls syllogisms from Aristotle. But in terms of ordinary universities, that's exactly what we've done. We've killed logic. Hegel calls it the dead bones of logic. And so in this conversation right now, I feel like, okay, we've invited in a lot of controversies in the metaphysical Hegelian change the world metacognition space. And to bring some closure in, this is where I hope it's fertile ground. Like you said, we're bringing in all these oppositions to create fertile ground for a convergence that is not oppressive. It is a sense making of coherence rather than confusion, conflation, or a reduction of potential. So this is what Hegel calls genuine freedom. When you bring together in the true synthesis, you are putting in rules, but when those rules are in their truth or in their essence, then they achieve a destiny, which the restrictions in that sort of sweet spot actually releases more freedom than if you just had abstract freedom or just complete abilities to do whatever you want. And so that sweet rule setting in the essence of things is what we're trying to get to. And all these great minds like Vervaeke and Smachtenberger and Landry, they're all intuiting it, but they can't translate it into a shareable way, which is logic. Logic underpins grammar, which underpins language, which underpins interpersonal ethic or self-ethic, and then interpersonal ethic, and then to family life, and then into civil society, and then into state, and then into international state politics, and into global world spirit, Hegel calls it. And then
So
that
in other
world spirit.
but in other words, logic is then the substrate or the building blocks for all of it to emerge.
All meaning making, yes. So this
And so
threads
he
back
says,
into
Hegel's saying that reason is the only basically real thing, right? Basic, like
well,
what the actual quote is. I think his term is let's see. There was an actual quote that I'm thinking of. You might know what it is, but it's basically like
is actual is rational, is rational is actual.
He says the rational alone is real.
Mhm.
So that's kind of what you're pointing to, is like we got to go down to this sort of substrate level of the rational, right? And I think that guys like Forrest have absolutely done that. In fact, he's built from that sort of ground level up, and he's kind of emerged his own sort of his metaphysics has sort of come through him. I would say he wouldn't even say he created it. He's just sort of discovered it. Is his way of interpreting that. I'm actually having another conversation with him in a couple of weeks, so I'm going to try to like unpack more of this, but it's very inaccessible to the average person. Like you said, normal cognition steeped in regular paradigmatic mind, as you know, or whatever you want to call it, like our complicated mind, right, versus complex mind. We're not holding these polarities, we're not holding these opposites, and we're not reconciling the paradoxes very well. Like it's not intuitive in the way that our culture and our language is sort of steeping us. And in fact, even from just the very basic fundamental level of subject object, right? We identify as subjects separate from the objective world, you know what I mean? And so we don't see that deeper layer, the sublation or whatever you want to call it, where there's actually a unified field. The things go together. It's the yin and the yang together that makes the totality. Like, we are the totality. We're not just the one half or the one part. We're not just the subjective. We are, in fact, subject and object's relationality with itself, like together, right? And that is kind of, at first, it's a mind fuck, but it's also this huge relief when you really get that, because you're not just a separate self and ego wrapped up in a bag of skin here on probation, like a stranger alone and afraid in a universe you never made, right?
Yes, well said. I feel like if you do this the right way, it's supposed to be paradise on earth. So some of the religious stuff, kingdom come and all this, nirvana, it is supposed to happen here in the finite world if you access the right way of seeing these opposites in harmony with each other when they are distinct and when they are the same. So even the triad, or the synthesis of unity and difference, is itself in a unity. So when you think about what Buddha was saying, if we want to use that sort of religious mode, we would say that this is non-dual consciousness of itself and its opposite. That's how all true notions work in that universal logic. The abstract understanding, the negative moment of reason, and then the positive moment is the sublation. So all these older wisdom traditions were doing universal logic. It was just half sensuous and half super sensuous. And that's another opposition that I'm putting into the mix here. So now we have quite a bit going.
Can you
Basically,
make that example for me in the Hegelian terms? You said the negative point of reason, the positive, and there's one part of the triad.
Abstract understanding, yeah. The first principle.
So walk me through a dummied down example of that.
So for instance, let's use duality and non-duality itself. So that's a concept, it's a thought, but thoughts also have being to them, which is another contradiction that is not resolved in non-duality. So when you understand the universal logic in its pure form, it is super sensuous. So to unpack that word, it just means what we think is the mind, the inner world of the mind, pure thought. There's actually a transcendental version of that is objective in itself, and that's what religion and nirvana and heaven and all that stuff is supposed to be about. But if you're secularist and you're watching this, the thing that Hegel has done is he makes it make sense as science. This is the realm of pure science grounding its own self. So it's a super coherent system.
Would that map onto Platonic ideal forms? Is that kind of the idea?
That's what Plato was trying to map out exactly. But what Hegel says was the limit of Plato was that he left that realm of forms indeterminate, meaning that he had the right sort of form of it, but he couldn't define it into a functional, useful system of science. He didn't have a system on it. Plato came after Socrates. Socrates kind of opened this dialectical process a little bit more. Parmenides opened up this world of pure thought first with pure being, which sounds paradoxical, but when you realize pure being in its concept, it's in the inner world. So he grasped both of them in the pure form. That's where genuine philosophy is to have started. Real wisdom, in a metacognitive sense, that we know it's wisdom, started with Parmenides. Right after this guy named Thales tried to find the first principle of all true knowledge. And he was stuck in that religious mode. He was trying to break out of this sensuous versus super sensuous. And he could sense that there was a oneness to everything, the universal. And he got close. He said it was water. Water was the universal. Everything, here's water, everything builds off of water. And it was like the beginning of science, or an attempt at it, to get out of the religious mode of consciousness and into this philosophical side. So Parmenides comes right after that. And he says, well, actually, what he's sensing is this pure thought concept of pure being. And Hegel says, okay, that's where we get this kind of clear break in human history between this sort of sensuous, super sensuous mixture and into the first, at least one thought that is purely super sensuous for the first time, grasp the super sensuous. And he says, that's the first universal thought of wisdom, is right there. And everything else builds off of that first principle. So history also follows this universal logic. It's not just in our heads. Everything structured in the universe that is true follows the universal logic, including the actualization of spirit through human history, through us as individual agents. And you can resonate with that or not. So we kind of get this Platonic moment coming after Parmenides and after these pre-Socratics, and then you get Socrates kind of mastering it in dialogue. So it looks subjective. It looks like it's just a language process between two finite creatures of cognition, or two agents, maybe, Vervaeke. I hope Vervaeke watches this. But Hegel says that, well, the reason why Plato is higher than Socrates, even though Socrates was their master, is because in the immediate sense, Socrates was in tune with the resonance of life through his inner oracle, his inner genius, Hegel calls it, which basically to us would mean his subconscious, and that he had this like natural talent to tap into the truth, but he couldn't do it consciously. In fact, he says there's lots of stories of Socrates going into cataleptic states, these sort of hypnotic states in military, where that state of channeling is what allowed him to have those incredibly entertaining Socratic dialogues where he could twist any concept into its opposite through that universal logic, because he could see both sides, he could see that contrast. And then he didn't quite know how to describe the system, but people would watch him and they would sort of absorb it in a sort of immersive way. So Plato came after, and when you're external to the medium, it creates an ability to contrast, it sharpens. So Plato comes and he starts to systematize the principle of what Socrates was embodying after the pre-Socratics, especially Zeno and Parmenides, started up the first two moments of universal logic. And then one of the guys who comes after, Leucippus or somebody comes after, and it was Heraclitus. And then after Heraclitus, it starts to become into determinate being, Democritus. All these types of guys start to fulfill the three first moments of universal logic as universal thought. And then Socrates comes and starts using it in conversation very fluidly. And then Plato starts to systematize that in the pure thought world, not even just in the subjective world of finite being. And then after Plato comes, of course, Aristotle. And Aristotle, Hegel says, was like the creme de la creme, where he did everything. All these opposites were coming into system for the first time. And we're getting these big chunks of actual universal logic or infinite science. But we lost a lot of Aristotle's writings. So we got these, it was already kind of fragmented, but now we only have fragments of the fragments, which is why we can't rebuild the holism that he was coming from, which Hegel calls the notion. And you used that earlier to identify that contradiction between convergence and divergence. So now we're getting into the weeds a bit. It goes way, way, way deeper, but we're starting to get into the meat. I'm a vegan, so we're getting into the potatoes of what of what we need to solve or get into to solve the meaning crisis, and then the meta crisis, and then the poly crisis. So I want to sort of, I know I said a lot there, maybe you want to reset, but I want to return back to where we were at in the beginning of the conversation and define the problem we're trying to solve, which might add more contrast to why the universal logic in these three moments clarifies our reality as agents in a way where we can create systems of coherence that's the right way of convergence that allows for an infinite diversity in the story modes of narrative, art, and religion, but comes together in one essence. So you get the diversity and the divergence and the convergence all happening at the same time, but in the right way to solve this incredible problem that we're running out of time to solve. Especially as things continue to diverge. It's getting harder to solve the problem unless we have this kernel of cohesion that rises up at the same time.
Yeah.
So with all that context, where do you feel like would be the most, the best sense making we could do together?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot. And you're right. There's a lot of open doors. I feel like I do a pretty decent job of sitting in uncertainty, and I feel like that's where I'm at right now. Is sitting in holding just uncertainty here, but not closing off. I'm feeling open and curious as to what's trying to come through and piece together here. So I feel quite, just through my journey, I feel like I've gotten a pretty decent understanding already of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis sort of mode, right? The dialogical kind of thing that we're trying to do here, and that I think is sort of also the trinity or the structure of this universal logic, right? And I think that there's more to it than that, like the the triad that there was another triad, right, that you were pointing to, which is the abstract thinking, the negative, and the positive triad as well, which I feel like I need more unpacking. I don't know if it's the right time to do that now, or we want to go to the meta crisis and frame up the problem a bit. So I'll leave it up to you if you want to like gonna get there eventually, if you want to help me unpack that a bit more now.
So now we're balancing in terms of the way the notion's working through me, because it is like a weird channeling. It's like your agency, you have free will, and then there's like this like automatic objectivity that's happening through you, which is why we can recognize science, or why there is an objective universe, at least to the degree of our cognition in the many worlds theory. This is another contradiction, which we'll leave off to the side for a second. But I feel like to be practical and theoretical at the same time, we should try and get somewhere in terms of, okay, how do we apply this triadic universal logic, abstract, negative, positive, in a way that makes sense to talk about this creating a solution to something that will make this conversation very hard to have in like months from now.
And even if, because this is the other problem too, I feel like that a lot of these conversations in this sort of kind of galaxy brain headspace of people trying to think mega abstractly about huge global issues and, systemic problems, and then trying to weave together, seemingly very complicated abstract thinking. It's just over the head of most people. And so maybe rather than just like, hey, how does universal logic solve for the mega crisis, as you say, why don't we instead just say, like, does it grow corn? You know what I mean? Like, can we do something practical? Like, what does it do for me in my daily life as a human, right? And like, why is it something I should pay attention to, and why is it something I should care about, or submit my subjectivity and my inner cognition to this structure, to this sort of formula?
That's a great way to start. I got an intuition just now that that's probably the best way to start, because we'll talk about, okay, why should we be doing this? Because we're about to get into the weeds pretty deep. If I try and explain the triad here, I'm going to have to start using absolute definitions. And as soon as that starts to occur, this conceptual space, this inner universal space starts to become apparent. You start to be aware that the real inner world is much greater than what you're seeing. And it starts to create this hopelessness feeling and a tiredness and like this heaviness. It's like, whoa, we're in different conceptual universes. So I'm preparing that that's going to happen. Because to explain the triad correctly, the way Hegel means it, and overcoming this dead scholarship about him that's been happening for 250 years between the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians, we can't use any of their definitions because they're one-sided finitudes. The real definition is that non-dual kind, where both opposites are happening simultaneously. In fact, even the opposition between duality and non-duality is itself a duality that has to be transcended by non-duality. So there's like another layer of meta-reflexivity that happens on top of metacognition. So it really gets deep really fast, which is why no one's been able to understand the true Hegel for 250 years. And the reason why I was able to do that is because I started very young. Poverty allowed me to like get into the inner world because I didn't have any sensuous privileges. So it forced me to go inwards. And I just stayed dedicated to that. And now after reading Hegel for 4,000 hours, now I understand how to do the triad correctly because I grasped the right way of it in its opposite modes. You have to do both of them.
Yeah, so that's cool that, I mean, I feel really stoked that you've done that deep dive so that I can glean something from your experience. However, I see a contradiction or an issue here, which is that if this is some sort of key that unlocks solution space, so to speak, right? Like some sort of catalyst towards reunion or convergence and synthesis, right? That brings us away from crisis and dystopia and into some sort of more beautiful world. If that's the case, I just it can't require 4,000 hour investment from every human. That's just not going to ever happen. So it needs to be, and to me, like, things, the symmetry of the Trinity is so intuitive. It's baked into our religions, and you know what I mean? It's like it's already in the background framing and context of the human mind in some fundamental way. So I think that there should be a very simple, very clear and very just intuitive way to grasp this that could be taught to a child. And if it isn't that, then I don't know how true it really is, because I think the truth is actually, it should feel like a child should be able to resonate with it, in my opinion.
You're exactly right. And so what I was doing in my last commentary is I said, we should start with what you said earlier, which is like this simple, what's the point of this? How do we use this? And then I said, that's going to lead into talking about this triad and getting into the weeds. And I was unpacking that problem that you just said, that it's going to start looking like a child can't learn this because universes of meaning are going to open up. And then after I made that comment, I was going to say, then once we get into the weeds a bit and get a little coherence, then we're going to apply that to clarifying the mega crisis and how the meta crisis and the meaning crisis and the poly crisis are all in a certain order. And that ordering we'll try and put in terms of the triad in the right way, and then start to get to this feeling of, oh, that is basically returning back to the first thing we were trying to do that a child can understand, which is agreement. So my mind is building a picture. So you see me very visually. Here's our starting point. And the point of this is to say, what's the point of doing all this? Well, it's to create agreement. And then we're going to move to this weeds thing, a universal meaning triad thing. And then we're going to go to solving this poly crisis thing, and then, or mega crisis. And then this clarity on the mega crisis is going to lead back to an agreement of some kind. And it just keeps repeating. And that's like the fractal process. So in my mind, it feels very simple because I can see the notions, but I know what it looks like without the notion. And it's like, we have like 20 things open right now and they don't seem to connect because people who are watching this right now are in the mode of ordinary consciousness to a certain degree. And if they weren't, they'd be creating the solution already. Forrest Landry and Dan Smachtenberger and these sort of mystics, and John Vervaeke, they're like the closest in terms of like modern academia, maybe. Like they're close enough that they could probably write some papers and be taken seriously. But most mystics who really get this put it in religious mode, and they're just like written off as fairies, or like they're written off as like, you know, druids or something, where they're not taken seriously by science, which is a shame. Like even Marianne Williamson's presidential campaign was decimated because she used the word psychic in one of her speeches once, and she's not taken seriously in many ways. And, you know, she recently called off her campaign because it was so excruciating. And then she got this second win, and now she's starting it back up again because she's realizing this is it. It's like there might not be another election after this the same way they're happening now, because in the next 6 months, AI is going to basically take over everything. So back to the top here. Okay, so if people who are watching this are in ordinary consciousness and seeing it as diversity and not as these essential dualisms and non-duality, let's try and tighten it up a bit. What we're really needing in humanity right now, that is the highest level of currency, is agreement. And it sounds like a very basic, simple word. We use agreement all the time. It's not autopogenesis or like agency or all these fancy words that sort of in these high academic circles people throw around to make it sound like we're really getting a hold of things. Well, what is agreement really, if you think about it? What does the definition of agreement really, really mean? On a surface level, we know what it means. It's like, oh, just two people are in likeness on an object. They're agreeing on an object between them, and they share that in the same way. Agreement has some kind of feeling like that, and a child can grasp that. But then if you unpack those words, well, what is an object? What is the notion of double or two? What about oneness to two-ness? And you start unpacking those words, and then you get into the weeds. Then you start getting from, okay, why does agreement really matter? What does it mean? And then as soon as you get into its meaning, you get into the meaning crisis. And you start getting into these, well, what structure should we use? Or what structure should we agree upon to agree upon the definition of agreement to begin with? And you end up in these self-reflexive loops that seem to be going around in circles and not getting anywhere. And that's why modern science tried to break that circularity, that tautology type of feeling, and linearize things into a system that actually has real clear limits, beginnings and ends and connections, and not this weird sophist logic that Socrates tried to stop like thousands of years ago. It seems like it's happening again. Well, basically, you need to realize, I think, or this audience needs to realize, or it'd be helpful to realize, that the only real currency is agreement, because all the resources in reality are fashioned into goods and services by human labor, or by processes of nature that we as human beings recognize as useful to us. And so this agreement structure is really needed for us to work together to create economies and create goods and services that we can share, and share in a way that we agree upon, that feels fair and reciprocal. So without agreement, you can't even use resources. And so this is why I think some of these economists were saying that, okay, agreement needs to be firmed up a little bit more to have these economies where we're not destroying ourselves. So agreement comes down to meaning making, because you need to somehow understand what you're talking about clear enough to create distinctions where agreement is possible, or else you just have pure conflation. So think about it that way. We're doing this because without agreement, life sucks. You know, you can't have friendships. You can't even like yourself. If you don't even know who you are, you're lost in yourself. Psychosis can be triggered if you get overwhelmed. All these types of things happen. And in fact, science itself is like we're trying to find agreement with our thoughts and our models about the universe, our maps with the terrain. We're trying to find agreement there, which we call coherence in an objective sense. So that might have been a little bit complicating a very simple term.
Well, there's something here. There's the notion of intimacy as purported by Gaffney. Hang on one second. I'm going to grab it. I actually want to read this because this is, I think, perfect for agreement. I'm just going to pause this recording. All right. So from First Principles and First Values, which is just, I think, barely just going live. I got a pre-order of it, but if anyone's interested, I think it should be available for purchase soon, or for pre-order. But so they sort of create this intimacy equation. So intimacy equals shared identity times relative otherness times mutuality, which mutuality is recognition plus feeling plus value plus purpose. So basically, I think that is a cool definition to sort of point to this notion of agreement that you're trying to unpack. So there's in agreement, there's this sense of a shared identity, right? And you also have to have a sense of relative otherness, right? Like we can say from the substrate level of the cosmos of God, we're all one. So there's no otherness on that level. But on the level of me and you, then self, we are separate. And so you and I have a sense of relative otherness. You're in Canada, I'm in the United States. You know what I mean? Like we're doing this sort of this otherness dance, but we're finding a sense of, to the degree that we find a sense of shared identity and mutuality, that creates a field of intimacy, right? And so I really like that word, and I think Gaffney and Stein, these guys are nailing it in defining sort of the solution or the problem. So they would call the meaning crisis a global intimacy disorder, right?
Yeah, and somebody passed it to me, his work. He said, watch this video and tell me what you think. And I actually did pay attention because I think it was a really big investor. And I said, okay, I can kind of show the power of this, because what they're meaning by intimacy is like this inwardness of being. So to get into the metaphysical definitions of what they're talking about, this universal logic, what they're approximating with these words is the universal logic, and they're getting close. And intimacy has an inwardness to it. It's like an inner connection. And Hegel says that when you see things truly, it's in the inner unity of what he calls the notion. So where all these oppositions are happening as a oneness. And in a way,
well,
what you're calling that.
Sorry, go ahead. I don't want to cut you off. Finish
No,
your thought.
I'm interested in what got triggered there.
Well, a notion of intimacy it is an inward thing, but it's also an outward thing. So it's in the way that they're using the notion, it's actually nested at every level of reality. So you could think of protons and electrons having this sort of allurement or intimacy that brings them into a shared field, and then we could call that an atom. And then those atoms have this sort of shared intimacy or agreement, whatever you want to call it, this mutuality in the context of relative otherness, right? Like each atom is its own atom. So there's a relative otherness, but then it brings it together, and then you create these sort of multicellular structures, and then you end up with, going up and up the stack in both chemistry, physics, biology. All of it is constituted of these sort of nested or fractal levels of intimacy happening on every single domain and every single level. And so on the human level, or the mesoscopic scale, right, we are in an intimacy disorder in some sense. Like we're fully in our relative otherness. We're super other right now, right? So that's what we're talking about the need for consensus, for consilience, for agreement, for synthesis, right? For convergence, all these words of, those are essentially all forms of intimacy. It's ways of us realizing, like Carl Sagan said, we're all on that mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam together. You know what I mean? Every human that's ever lived has played out their lives on that pale blue dot. So yeah, hopefully that helps. I think we have agreement about this sense of agreement.
Yeah, I like that. Nice pun there. Nice play on words. If you look at the equation they have there, in terms of the triad, so I want to keep to our structure because it'll add some coherence to what is otherwise looking to people, probably looking like a sort of divergence is occurring. And it's like, oh, we're never going to get anywhere. And every conversation starts to feel this way. But I want to give some hope that, nope, for once you understand universal logic, it's absolutely anchored. So no matter how many topics get stacked on, I'll just make a couple of notes, or whoever's keeping track will keep notes, and it all starts to come back under a kind of gravity. A gravity of meaning starts to pull them back into coherence, and that's what we're trying to do now. So to rein it in, because now we've introduced another concept, this Mark Gaffney guy, and this whole equation, and it does relate to the agreement structure, but now let's relate it to the triad structure a little bit more, and say, okay, well, intimacy has this feeling of inwardness, but it also has this contradiction built in where it's like, well, it's also outwardness, because their whole storyline is that love is the answer, and love making and rituals and sensuousness is all a part of this story making. We need a new story of intimacy, I think is what they called it, but that's still only the first mode of it. There's technically 5 total meta modes, and so they're getting the first one right. But they're kind of approximating because they don't have the universal logic clear enough to know the metaphysical determinations absolutely in that equation. So to make it absolutely clear, we have to put it in the form of the notion, which is the triad, which is the Trinity, but in the right way. So the notion has an extra little piece on top where if you copy and paste the triads, you're doing it wrong because you have rote memorization. And if you have rote memorization, Hegel calls that torture to the soul, torture to learning. So you're not supposed to do it in this choppy kind of way. There's an inner understanding, is an inward immanence of connecting of things through their necessity as they're happening to you in this kind of playfulness of reality, this sort of cosmic yin yang.
I'll use an example of a triad that Forrest Landry has put forth that I find to be quite intuitive and the right order, which is conscious, sustainable evolution. And there's a relation, conscious, sustainable evolution. So there's this relationship, there's this bound triple between consciousness, sustainability, and evolution or change, right? Like, and in that order, it seems like there's this sort of, for me, it feels natural. You know what I mean? Especially because that's like, to me, the ideal that we're sort of shooting for. We're shooting for some kind of conscious, sustainable evolution. Obviously, if evolution is going on an unsustainable track and an unconscious track, then we end up in, a race to the bottom that we're in now.
Yeah, race to the bottom, exactly. That's the incomplete moment of capitalism, which doesn't erase capitalism. It just means it has to be completed in those 3 moments of the universal logic. So right now, capitalism is in its abstract understanding moment, and then it's supposed to go into its negative moment, the dialectical moment, which is socialism, which then sublates into the 3rd moment, which is supposed to be communism, but not historical communism. That was not real. It was not the actual synthesis of all 3 of those. It was the negation of capitalism. It was like, no, cancel all the capitalism, but that's an engine of that notion. So now in the new kind of harmony, the new sense making that we're embarking upon to solve the meaning crisis, we're taking all the opposites and we're making them moments, fluid moments of each other, so nobody gets excluded if they're a capitalist or a socialist or a communist or an anarchist. They all fit in the right order.
It might help to, and be less triggering as well, to, instead of using the isms or whatever of the different ideologies, we could talk instead maybe about like maybe the triple of something like egalitarian, or what's the type of archy that would be? Like you have hierarchy. What's the opposite of hierarchy?
Egalitarianism.
Right. So I was wondering if it ended with archy.
Yeah.
Like there was
horizontal archy.
Right. So, but you have this egalitarian sort of hunter-gatherer mode, right, that humans have been in. And then you have sort of the hierarchical mode, right? And those seem to be the tension of the thesis antithesis or whatever. So the synthesis of that might be something like a synarchy, or this relationship where kind of like subordinated leadership, where the person with the right knowledge or the particular skill or gift in the situation has the authority, right? So it's sort of subordinated depending on context, if that makes sense, right? And I would say communism, whether it's the when I hear you say it, even if I can somehow remove it from the sort of horrors of the past and history, I still don't get the intuition or the vibe of the sovereign individual and the autonomy of the agency and the sort of subordinated, contextualized leadership that could come from something like a synarchy. So, anyways, hopefully that helps. I just think that okay, so let's keep going with this like triple idea, and maybe we can invoke the triple that you messaged me about. I think it was nature, spirit, and logic.
So that's going to get into the ever living meetings, but let's build up to that a little bit. And
Okay.
we're aiming for about a half an hour, but I feel like this is going quite not too bad actually. So maybe we're going to get somewhere very highly useful. So in terms of like keeping a little bit under control, so we said agreement needs to be defined. That's the purpose. It's the currency of things, even practical life. And then that requires understanding what meaning making is, which requires these triads and this universal logic of abstract understanding, negative moment of reason, and then the synthesis in the right way, which we're trying to nail down. And now we have like at least 3 good examples of how to apply this triad structure, not in the dead way, but in this living way, which we haven't talked about too much. But the example you just gave was between hierarchies, horizontal non-hierarchies, and then the mix of the two is the synthesis, the synarchy, to try and offset the triggering of the controversy regarding capitalism, socialism, and communism. And then this is supposed to get down to the intimacy of this Mark Gaffney guy, who I also heard was pretty triggering. There's, I guess, some sensuous stories there that I guess are really causing some problems. But basically their equation of intimacy is shared identity, otherness, and mutuality. And that's another triad. So the shared identity, I believe, is the abstract understanding moment. Then the otherness is the negative moment of reason, the dialectical. And technically this creates determinism. So any difference, before difference develops as essence, which is a higher mode, it is really just determinism. So determinacy can only be possible when you have 2 opposites in that sharpening that you mentioned earlier. So then you have this otherness happening here as the second moment of reason, the moment of tension. And then you sublate that into the third moment, which is the positive moment of reason, that mutuality, where you find what is common in the difference. And the commonality is really universality. And you can do that with everything if you have the right general logic, which is what Hegel's science of logic is when it's understood in that non-dual, in its complete form, which is what's missing in Hegel scholarship for the last 250 years and is not present in either the right Hegelians or the left Hegelians. And I've only found a couple of people who are trying to do the synarchy, trying to merge them, because they knew that Hegel was doing something more profound than one-sidedness. So in terms of Mark Gaffney's work there, I think that's how we would turn it into a universal notion in its clarity. And I think that would make sense. That's why it has a resonance to us intuitively.
Yeah,
right?
I want
And
to I want to also just like hover on this on since we're talking about Mark, other Mark Gaffney. And
then another
yeah.
conflation.
So he's, just to do it a little bit of justice, and I highly recommend checking out his work, whether there's controversy or whether there's human flaws or whatever, whether there's fire where there's smoke or whatever, right? Like if there really is stuff, to me, the sign of a well-adapted, plastic, flexible mind is somebody who can consider an idea and really understand it and embody it and put on a worldview and understand it without getting lost in it, right? So like I can go down into the weeds with you and try to really get what it is you're saying and really try to embody the view. And then I can actually take those lenses back off at the end of the conversation. You know what I mean? Like, and I can ideally be able to actually look at the world view itself and look at the lenses instead of just through the lenses. So that's, I would just encourage anybody, whether it's Gaffney or whether it's anyone else who's, some mixture of really strong, signal or juice mixed with humanness and flaws, right? Like that's pretty much every quote unquote guru. right? Like they all come with kind of a mix of both. So but to do it justice, the idea here, the Hegelian sort of dialectic here that he's promoting is, we talked about the non-dual mode, right? Which would be on the positive. So it's abstract, the abstract, sorry, define it in the Hegelian terms. I'm just trying to get the lingo down for myself. It's the abstract, the negative, and the positive. But say it again.
Yeah, the abstract understanding. And
Okay.
this is where the common sense moment, to understand what abstract understanding feels like, it's what common sense feels like. And then
Okay.
once you get out of the common sense mode, you get into the negative moment of reason, which
Got
is
it.
the dialectical. And then you
Got it.
get into the positive moment of reason, which is sublation.
Gotcha. Okay, so this is perfect. So then in Gaffney's work, this would map onto the abstract moment of reason would be the common sense of I am a separate self. I am a person, right? I am me, and me is what's inside my skin, not outside
Mhm.
my skin, right?
Agency,
So
maybe.
yeah, agent, right? The sovereign self, right? Which is what Western Enlightenment was all about. It was, human rights, and it was built on this idea that selves matter and humans matter, which was a new idea. We used to think of human life as very disposable. Um, so it's actually been, somewhat of an enlightenment to actually recognize that individual autonomy and sovereignty. So that's the sort of abstract moment of reason. The negative, sorry, what's the term? The negative.
Negative moment of reason.
Okay, so it was abstract and just abstract moment of reason and negative moment of reason. Is that what you called it? Okay.
Well, there's two oppositions, another contradiction embedded in this universal triad, right? Because I'm saying the first moment, or Hegel is anyway, is called abstract understanding. And it's important to know that understanding comes there,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Because then
So
the
for
next
me,
moment is
it's
negative
like
moment of,
it's not super intuitive to remember those words. I don't know why. I get that one's the sort of common sense, the abstract understanding. Okay. Then you have the negative moment of reason, which is sort of the antithesis, right? And so you have the thesis and the antithesis. So the thesis is I am a separate self, I'm a sovereign soul. And then the antithesis is like, actually, we're all one and there's no separation. And this is sort of Eastern mysticism and the Eastern Enlightenment and the way of Zen and the way of Taoism and Buddhism. And it's like there's really this awareness, this deeper understanding that there's really just the field of consciousness of pure being, which is what we are. And so like tat twamasi, like thou art that, right? Like you are not separate. And fundamentally, what is it that you're pointing to that is the separate self, and point to it, bring it forth, show me where it is, you know what I mean? It's like it exists in this context of this universal field. So that would be the antithesis. And then the positive
not quite.
okay.
Well, no,
Well,
let's hear how your last one moment is, because it might clarify for me. Sure, what's the last one for you?
positive sublation here,
Mhm.
the synthesis would be, yes, you are the field. Yes, we are the one. Yes, we are all God, right? There's, by definition, nothing outside of God. There's nothing outside of the realm of cosmos or universe or whatever you want to call it. Universe meaning one, right? Uni one. So there is nothing outside of the one. That's true. Also, you are, in fact, subjectively you having an experience, right? There is a you-ness as well. And so the sublation here, the synthesis here, is the unique self, which is to say true self, or the one, having a separate self experience, right? So God having a Christian experience, or cosmos having a Mark experience, or however we want to define that. And that unique self is true self through your unique perspective, through your unique subjective lens. So if true self is the light, then the light is shining through a unique lens that's fractaling the light, fracturing it into this prism that has only ever come on this way. It's a singular thing. There's no other self in the cosmos that ever has existed or will ever exist that is this exact configuration of cosmos, right? So the unique self is sort of the synthesis of the separate and the true, or the whole, the one and the many, right? So hopefully that makes sense, but I would say that's Gaffney's interpretation. And it does feel like this universal logic to me.
You're right. And that's why these investors are telling me, go contact these dudes. And I'm like, you're right, I'm going to contact them. And I did. And what's happening is that the way that I'm communicating it is not jiving with them. Well, to be honest, I really think that there's two things going on. One is that their attention is being pulled away by sexy or sensuous things, and that this Hegel thing is so hard that people are like, I just don't want to get into it. And then the other thing too is there's an ego battle that's starting to form up as I sort of start to rise. And, in some ways I'm trying to offset that by saying I've taken the vow of unabandonment for everybody. Because when you get into leadership positions, at least in my experience, there's all this temptation that happens. All this sensuous privilege comes to you because it's the divine idea in sensuous form. That's what beauty is, Hegel says, and I think he's right. So as you rise up in this sensuous power, and you have some of the essence of the super sensuous.
Sensuous for me again? Like, just what do you mean by that? Just like sensual, like of the senses, like human, very much like embodied, kind of almost erotic kind of energy.
Yeah, that's why I think Gaffney and them are on the erotic thing. Is sensuousness is 5 senses: taste, touch, sound, and then your super sensuous is what we normally call the 6th sense, but it's a lot more profound than we normally think. So this is where it's a very simple way to understand it. All the finite stuff, all the 5 senses are finitude. And so when you rise up in power and you have enough of the essence, the super sensuous logic in you, then it attracts more. And that's why we get these virtuous cycles, economic cycles, that create the business cycle where we have rich and poor all the time. And that's why our economies aren't in flow state. They're also in this dual kind of consciousness instead of that harmony. That's what poverty is. And so I feel like, okay, if we have this battle going on between sort of me and these really high level guys that have the keys of power of getting ideas into the new sphere, into like the actual global consciousness, we need to solve this problem of communicating the idea to them and also solving the power dynamic. And I felt like John Vervaeke and Forrest Landry and Daniel Smachtenberg would have been the perfect starts because they know how to recognize the truth from the ego, and they'd be able to give me space to make mistakes, and I'd give them space, and we'd start to work our way through it. And I really thought it was going to be like I thought in 1 hour, me and Daniel Smachtenberger, we're going to be like, boom, got it. And we would make space for each other. In fact, it was one of his investors that came and visited me on New Year's, and then he brought his gurus with him too, which was really where I thought it was going to happen.
I'm just trying to understand why there's a battle. You use the word battle, and like, is that how are you actually being in some way like I'm wondering why you're using that term, because I don't see well, actually, I think that there is this sort of very human hierarchical thing playing out, right? And it happens in intellectual academic space. It happens in the spiritual guru space. It happens pretty much on every level. And so it's like we have to be very mindful of how, we're showing up. Like, are we bringing our own ego into the mix? Like, is that what's ruling us, right? Like, not to say we shouldn't have the ego integration, but because obviously there's to try to like just be at war with your ego is to be in contradiction, and it's going to actually come out in this worst sort of shadow form. So it's not to, I think there's actually something beautiful about accepting the ego, and that's sort of the will to, and it's the ambition. It's sort of the ordering principle. It's the thing that's going to actually get anything done. So my question are you saying that there's this ego battle or this issue where you feel like you've got this sort of insight into something fundamentally profound and universally true that they're missing, that they don't want to see because of an ego? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like that backwardsness, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. The dialectical nature of the universe flips you into your opposite because it's sort of where irony comes from. Hegel says in the moment of poetry, irony is just a dialectic working its way through in 3 different modes. But with me interfacing now with the power structure, I did my homework and I have a very good understanding of Hegel. And now I'm just learning how to teach it in ways that people can understand, and sort of interface with roughly 137 modes of expression. So 137 modes of sensuousness or symbology is what I've started translating the universal logic into. There's only one universal logic as the essence, but it has 130, there's an infinite amount of sensuous expressions. That's the religious mode and artistic mode. So this is where the interfacing problem is, where I tried to pick the best people to spend time to start trying to influence. And I thought, oh, Vervaeke and my friends are pointing me to these guys and saying they're already referencing Hegel. And I thought, oh, this is synchronicity. This is going to work. And then when I came out there with enough humility to be like, hey guys, there's something really powerful here. How do I work at your level? How do what can I help with? I came in with confidence and assertiveness, but also with some degree of invitation to say, well, what are you guys working on? What should I help with? And it wasn't enough. And I came in with these Nobel Prizes too, to say, well, this logic is so powerful that it will create a signal. And one of the videos that I remember first watching when I was getting into their space was they were very big on this signal. And I was like, well, cool, we need a really strong signal that accreditates this universal logic in a way that the power structure can understand. And the current power structure is not religion or art, it's abstract science in the academia, right? So I thought, well, what if we get the Nobel Prize committees to endorse or give, you get an endorsement for one of the awards, then that accreditates the idea simultaneously as it's rising up in all these sensuous modes. So it's, instead of the hegemonic power crushing in abstract negation the idea as it's germinating, right? And trying to reduce your power through discrediting, reducing your social capital, calling you a cult, all these typical things that happen in every movement. Instead of that happening, you have this extra layer of protection. But a lot of people can't grasp. It's like, no, there's not one knowledge so profound you can win 6 Nobel Prizes simultaneously. But that's exactly what Hegel has done.
So
he did.
On that note, so we keep, I'm trying to converge, right? Because I know we're running out of time, and this is, so I'm trying to get to the core thing here, which is, what is, I mean, we've talked about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. We've talked about abstract understanding, negative moment of reason, and positive, what would you say? Positive what?
Positive moments of reason. Yeah.
So basically, okay, so I feel like that's it's actually not complicated. It's actually pretty intuitive once you sort of, unpack it a little bit. And I don't think that that's actually different at all from, like, I've used Mark Gaffney's example. I've used a Forrest Landry example of, and obviously John, his whole thing around dialogos is this exact formula of Socratic method, right? And so of trying to reach that logos, that sort of emergent truth, that higher level order, that synthesis, right? So I would make the case that all of those guys are 100% using this universal logic, unless there's something that I'm still not getting that's deeper, that you say is like down into the weeds or something. So what's the universal logic that I'm not grasping, that we haven't unpacked yet?
There's a lot here, so let me try and converge with you a little bit more too. What you're not grasping yet is the systematic nature of it, to make it shareable. So after this meeting with me, you're going to try and talk about it with other people, and you're going to get probably into the religion. Actually, you'll probably end up doing all of them. You'll do art, religion, and abstract science, but you won't reach genuine philosophy, that level of coherence that breaks out of the milieu of really talented people. So really talented people will be able to communicate the general universals. If this is like, me trying to diagram here, between abstract science and genuine science, there's like a chasm here. And the fifth meta mode is genuine philosophy. The fourth is abstract science or abstract philosophy. And then the second is religion. And then the first is art. So most human beings have to progress through art, religion, abstract science, and then technically abstract philosophy, and then genuine philosophy. So technically, I feel like you could probably take these universals and say, hey, there's some coherence in this meeting. You should probably go talk to this guy a little bit, take him a little bit seriously. Yeah, he looks weird, looks homeless, talking about Nobel Prize. Yeah, he looks crazy, all this stuff. In fact, he's wearing a mental health band on his arm. So this guy's really, and he has a heart in the background. That's totally crazy. This guy's totally unhinged. And then, that's what these guys are probably going to say. At least this is what the investor said to me. He said, Mark, these guys think you're sending the bad signal here. It's like you're going to ruin all their credibility with these millions of dollars that they're raising. And I said, I know, but they're inside the box and they're not going to make a difference anyway. Like, I have nothing to lose. I'm caught in a double bind where I'm in a no-win, like a dialectic within a dialectic. That's what a double bind is. So you can't use metacognition in a double bind to break out of it unless you have a culture of that kind of cognition to protect you to have or open that dialogue to meta. So this is where I'm like getting into these really interesting spaces where these guys should be able to unlock the double bind with me by getting past external appearances and getting to the inner residence. And I thought they would see it right away, like, wow, this Nobel surprise thing, it does look crazy, but he's right. This one idea of Hegel actually does solve these root contradictions in all the prizes and does create peace at the end of it. I thought that was going to happen. That's why I spent 10 hours making that video, as I thought one genius will watch that and resonate so strongly that, like, I don't know how to articulate what I'm feeling, but I know that this is it. And we had one genius, actually, I won't say his name because I don't want to get him in trouble yet, but we did have one guy watch it and say, yes, he recognizes that this is what he's been doing his whole life. And he went from being a Nietzsche lover to a Hegelian, like taking Hegel seriously. And he says, no one's been able to do that before. So in some ways, the higher up we get, the easier it will get for that resonance to happen, that intimacy will start building. So when I sent the signal out to Daniel and Vervaeke and these guys, when they rejected me in abstract negation and started pathologizing me, just like the establishment is, I thought, oh shoot, they're only at the abstract science level. They haven't crossed over yet. So I kind of thought, well, who can I talk to that's a little bit higher in terms of universal logic, implicitly in the mode of art and religion and science? And this guy came along, and he's like right in between genuine philosophy and abstract philosophy. So I was like, okay, we got one guy, but he's scared to stick his neck out because he doesn't know it enough to share it. Because as soon as you stick your neck out for me or universal logic, you're going to get all these negations that you basically take on the pain of the world at first. And so to protect people, I'm being very careful with the names. But to converge even further.
Can I ask you a question? Who else?
Oh, sure.
Who else is in the stratosphere with you in genuine philosophy?
So what I was telling individuals is that Hegel's knowledge is not normal human knowledge. Hegel was on the level of Buddha, Jesus, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Baha'u'llah. He's on that divine level. He says the science of logic is really God's mind or spirit's mind or the source's mind or truth's mind or infinite science's mind before the created world even existed. Yeah. But technically they're always eternal, so they always exist. So
there's been thousands of Christians and Buddhists and Muslims and mystics of all various traditions and walks of life who have been on that level of consciousness, right? You know, I don't think that there's this idea of like deifying a few humans as like, it's this weird sort of almost Girardian thing where anyways, the point is like, are you saying, or do you perceive that if only these other people could get to your level? Is that kind of what I'm hearing? Like that you're in the sort of genuine philosophy realm, and that all of these other sort of geniuses, or whatever you want to call them, are you know, kind of still trying to make their way up, but they haven't quite got there, because it feels like that's just another game of egoic hierarchical one-upmanship. And really, if you're, you know, if we're so good at if we've reached this state of enlightenment of Hegelian universal logic, or whatever it is, right, Christ consciousness, whatever mode of frame you want to, you know, flavor it with, then we should be seeking the synthesis, you know what I mean? And also, you know, with humility, not hubris, right? Like humility that, you know, maybe Forrest Landry has some signal, you know, maybe John has some signal, maybe Daniel has some signal, maybe Jordan has some signal, maybe these guys that are in this, they've been doing this sense-making thing for decades, have something to share. That's, and I'm not saying you don't have something to share as well. I'm just saying that I'm almost getting the vibe here that it's like a me versus them type of thing, or in the same kind of way, it's like a me versus the establishment kind of thing, right? And I just don't think that that's the case. I think you might actually be constructing that. And I don't know if they've actually done, I mean, I don't know if you've had genuine interactions where that's what the feedback you've gotten, but it just seems to me like it could be a projection or a construction that's not quite, because I mean, I haven't met all of them in person, but I know for sure someone like Forrest is very much going to be like, you know, a seeker of signal, a seeker of logos, seeker of truth, you know? So if you've got something worth talking to him about, he'll make time for you.
Right. That's what I thought. And so that's why, like, the way you're perceiving me right now, right? It's like, with the time left, I wanted to go back to get convergence on the agreement, the triads, the metacrisis. So I'll try and bridge these. For me, I don't feel lost at all. I'm like, okay, we're just opening more topics. So it once people start to become clear that they really, like, this really is profound, it starts to trigger other egos, right? Because they start to compete because they know there's no way they can win in the ordinary zero-sum game. And so I kind of came in and realized that we're going to clarify their work. And if they're stuck in the ego limit, that's going to happen. And they're going to project their limit onto me. So that's why I take the vow of unabandonment right away, is to say, I'm here to work with you. So I go into their systems and I spent hours studying Daniel and all these guys. And the latest one was Forrest Landry's, right? Somebody tagged me in the Meta Modern groups and said, Mark, you have to read Forrest Landry. And I'm like, who's Forrest Landry? And then I found out that on Daniel's website, he cites Forrest Landry as like the top dog, like, wow, he's incredible. So I was like, okay, this sounds like the highest source of this community. Let's go in there with assertiveness and confidence, but also enough humility to say, hey, this guy's amazing. He did all this stuff right. This guy's basically got the answer. All we're going to do is tweak it a little bit to put the immanent metaphysics, which is Forrest Landry's magnum opus, I guess, and put the immanent metaphysics into its immanent order. And so I thought, oh, this is a really cool example of how we can work together and lift his work, sublate his work, not cancel it, right? An abstraction negation. I'm better than Forrest Landry. Get rid of his metaphysics. That's garbage. That's child's play, blah, blah, blah. That's not what happened, because I understand that humility dynamic. And in fact, Daniel Smachtenberger puts it as one of his principles on his old website. So I'm like, okay, great. These guys understand these principles. So I came in, I read his entire metaphysics. It's short enough to be doable in like 6 hours. So I went through and it was very easy. He's so close that it was easy for me to just orientate things into the triads in the immanent order. And I just did it like, it was like natural. I was like, oh my gosh, this is the synchronous, this is going to work. So I sent it to my friends. I said, where should I send this? And said, here's his email address. So I emailed Forrest Landry directly. I said, your work is incredible. Daniel Smachtenberger is right. You are actually probably the best source to try and do this. I would love to talk with you. I would love to learn from you. Let's see if we can change the world together. And so I sent him that, and I never got a response. So then I went back to the community and I said, hey guys, did I do something wrong here? Is a Nobel Prize is too much? Should I tone it down? And it's no, he's actually sick. He's dealing with some horrible like life crisis. So I thought, okay, that sounds like a, at least plausibly deniable excuse to say, well, he just doesn't want to pay attention. But it turns out he actually was struggling through something. So I was like, okay, I'm going to create space for that and work on his time. And so I went and started trying to influence other people. And they just never heard back. And so I sent out another feeler and I said, hey, is he okay? Is he even alive? And oh yeah, he's alive. And then I found out he's making more podcasts. And then I realized, oh, he's just ignoring me. And then I found out that, well, I'm actually being mentally stigmatized. So in this group that's about mental health, they're actually becoming the opposite in a weird sense, because I'm so intense. And it's actually contributing to the twisting into the opposites, right? Where they're not taking time to really understand my context. Like, looking in this way is on purpose. Wearing this band was because on my last hunger strike, my university tried to stop me by detaining me through diagnostic momentum. So instead of actually like listening to me, the system is trying to marginalize me. And I thought that they'd be able to like give me space to explain why this is all happening, because it's a necessary moment to go through this change-making process. But they're also contributing to the stigmatization. And it's partly because I think it's such a high level thing where it's like, wow, you just imminently ordered my immanent metaphysics, and this is what gives me power in these communities. It could have been like a really like, whoa. It's like, no, this guy is like too crazy. And in fact, when I was trying to go through a system, I didn't tone it down a lot, because I really hold these guys in high regard. So I just give it to them full blast. And I'm like, they can handle this. And if I make a mistake, they'll correct me. And so there might be an actual element where it is losing them a little bit. And I'm underestimating how much this has changed my cognition, which is now becoming true months later. Now I do realize that's part of the problem. So I'm tapering back a little bit. And now I'm actually finding different modes to teach it through these ever-living meetings to clarify the meta-crisis and the polycrisis stuff into these triads by making 6 tribes. So I guess to close out nice and gently, I suppose, to tie it all together, we're trying to create agreement now with these super players who are incredible human beings. But this triadic process, when done in a dead way, seems artificial and doesn't create agreement. It creates more disagreement. And then the ordering of it gets all messed up. And then it triggers all these egoic battles where it's like, well, no, you're the egoic one, I'm the egoic. And then I'm like, well, let's just have a conversation. And now people, the only way to create a double bind and to perpetuate it is to not have conversation, to create silence. And that's what's happening to me, is I'm being silenced, so that if they give me anything at all, I can try and sublate that. But if they don't give you anything, you can't sublate. So it guarantees you're stuck there. So your podcast is sort of a way to say, well, you're giving me a chance to get my voice out there. If you're having Forrest on in a week or two, you say, well, this guy does have a weird thing, but it seems like there's more going on here than meets the eye. I don't know if he actually has mental illness. It sounds like he's aware of this, all this type of dialoguing. That's very meta, right?
What
But
I wouldn't
basically,
say mental illness. What I would say is that you're like you're almost, so if you use the sort of mystical frame, it's like when the prophet gets up on the wall and starts like sort of like, you know, uh testifying, right? Of his witnessing, sort of the mystery, and everyone's being like, this guy's lost his fucking marbles type of
yes, that's the stage we're
but,
at.
it doesn't mean there's not a signal. And I would also say, so, and the reason I wanted to talk to you is because I've picked up on it. I felt, and I would say one of my strengths, if I can use that word, is that I do have a pretty good level of discernment. And I think it comes from, like I said, my fundamentalist upbringing, and then sort of literally having to opt out of my entire worldview plus community. I mean, it was a whole package, cohesive, like life, right? That I sort of had to turn my back on in order, because I saw through the chinks in the story, right? And I saw that there was, light coming up that way, and I started finding my way out of the cave, right? And the point is like, I'm okay going against the herd. Like, I'm not sitting here like with these sort of authority figures on a pedestal saying like, oh, I can't talk to you because you haven't been approved by my guru. You see what I mean? Like, I could give a fuck less about all that noise. I care about the signal. And that's why I'll drop into dialogue with anyone. I'll sit on a sidewalk and talk to a homeless person because they're a human being with signal. So I'm not, I'm not categorizing you in any sort of box, and I'm not, writing you off. However, I would just say, like, this has been my experience, right? Because I had a similar thing where I reached out to someone who I respect and I see as a mentor, and solicited them for podcasts multiple times, and just kind of got, silence and stuff. And it was at first like, oh, there must be some sort of there must be like some ego thing, and the like controversy between him and I and all this stuff, right? But in reality, it's probably just like, dude, he's probably just got way too much shit going on. You know what I mean? Like, he's got people hitting him up all the time, and he's dealing with like managing all these different things in his life. And so I would just say, try not to take it personally until you actually have viable proof, like you have a dialogue and then or something, and they're just like, triggered, and they just like block you.
Well, this is where we are. So that's where I was, because I've been an activist for 20 years, so I know how to create connections and I'm very good at networking. So I gave lots of space, in fact, months and months. And Daniel did add me on Facebook, for instance, and we exchanged a few messages, and he did respond in there back and forth once or twice. And then his investor, or one of his investors, or somebody who knows him, I wish I could say the names, but they're making me not say anything. So I was like, okay. So he came and visited me, grilled me for like 9.5 hours or something, and tested me. And I said, how did I do? And he said 9 out of 10. I was like, oh, wonderful. And he says, the way that they're talking about me is they're saying I'm very assertive, very aggressive. And he says, Mark, they're telling me that you're coming in with all this hubris and all this like Nobel Prize, and you're really bombarding them. And I said, okay, well, why don't we read the message directly? So we sat there for a few hours and literally went message by message what I actually sent. And because he knows this one individual, and he'd already talked to this other individual directly, I felt like it was appropriate to do that because the messages were already being shared. So I said, well, let's just put them in order then. And then he actually saw how the conversation actually went, and he said, wow, that is not how you're being portrayed. Like, that's how the opposite is being portrayed outside of this. But he says, what I've read here does demonstrate humility. It does demonstrate a nice balance between the two. And I felt like, okay, so it isn't just me here. It is that, Daniel, for instance, is posting on his Facebook that he's just swamped. It's true. He's had his glow up moment, and I might be on the verge of mine too, but I'm going to manage mine a little bit differently. He got kind of swamped, and now he's kind of stuck in this, like, he's great at diagnosing, but he doesn't have like these emergent solutions that are powerful enough to solve the AI alignment problem, all this kind of stuff. And the third attractor, well, what is the third attractor? Well, the third attractor is universal logic. I strongly think it is. I might be wrong. There's some humility maybe there. but I would love to have the conversation with him. And I'm still open. So I kind of do know now that there's a bit getting back to me that it is a bit of just straight pathologizing, unfortunately, wrapped up in the fact that they are overwhelmed and they're amazing human beings. So it's a combination of those two things. But I really feel like if we had a couple of people bridge that gap and say, hey, you know what, let's have an actual dialogue that's constructive and mutually picks everybody up, and Mark gets a chance to explain the mental health ban and Nobel Prizes and all this stuff that looks crazy. It's just that he's trying to create this signal that he thinks is realistic given the problem.
If you'd like to, you can explain that right now. Go ahead, finish.
Sure. Like, so this is maybe where we'll try and apply the triads to where I'm at now to try and solve this problem, so that I stop triggering maybe the egos, or make it more translatable so we don't get a misunderstanding happening. Whatever is creating the otherness, I'm trying to sublate in a different way based on these experiences with these amazing people. And it's actually sharpened the approach and made it better. So what's happening now is, in terms of those triads, we had like the intimacy one, shared identity, otherness, mutuality. Then we had capitalism, socialism, communism. And then we had hierarchy, horizontality, and then synarchy. And now this last one, I think that can really clarify and teach in a way that's like not coming out with straight Nobel Prizes, is these tribes. And I'm calling them tribes because of the stuff in metamodernism and the stuff that I know about art, is that you have to engage people where they are, and most of humanity is in artistic or religious consciousness. So if we go into art, that's where all the tribal, the ritual stuff, all that kind of like early human development in terms of our instincts come from, and our primal needs. So in creating these tribes, we're translating this problem into basically spirit, nature, logic are the three most universal terms of the highest level container of all human knowledge that we need agreement upon. So if we agree upon the highest container, all the other containers of knowledge, or all the concepts within, should start orientating themselves within that container. That's not oppressive. It's not a convergence that is not truly the universal. I think Hegel's right. These are truly the most universal terms of which things naturally fit. And so we thought, okay, let's build tribes off of this. Order and origin are needed for definition. So let's make it a fun game where we just say, hey, what's your order of these three words? And it shows how your logic is processing them. And some people will align with the universal order. Some people have different rotations. But we found out that there's 6 tribes, and then there's like a 7th one that negates them. But it's a convenient way to organize the highest container to start figuring out and locating where people are, so we can start solving the meaning crisis, which is how John Vervaeke describes it. So this is sort of how I'm trying to bridge, if they end up watching this, or anybody who knows them, the craziness side, the fact that we're coming to coherence now from this like explosion of diversity of ideas we just talked about. They actually connect in the way that John's kind of talking about, but I want to add another layer of potential clarity. If I can have a little bit of hubris for a second, it's mostly Hegel. I'm just standing on the shoulders of these giants, really. I had to take my own little pet project, and I had to put that off to the side when I realized that what these guys of history had done is so far beyond what I was doing. It would have taken me the rest of my life to do it. So I had to set those aside. Now I feel like I'm continuing history, one of the agents of what he calls world spirit, which is why we're calling the movement world spirit, new world spirit. And anybody that tries to challenge me isn't really challenging me. They're challenging my understanding of all these amazing men that were better than me. But I understand enough of their system to get other geniuses to pay attention to this direction, this signal. And that's my goal. I'm just going to get the geniuses to move in this direction, so we stop maybe meandering a little bit too much and get somewhere where there might be a little bit of a faster approach. These guys will eventually get there. 100% they're eventually going to get there. But like, will they get there in 6 months from now when AI is going to become generally intelligent? Probably not. So I feel like, okay, my role is to play this bridging process, and using this absolute syllogism, this spirit, nature, logic is the simplest container to try and create agreement upon, to restructure the meaning crisis in a way that we can agree upon the problem, and then create this strange attractor that really is just the universal logic. That is the only real solution that we have to get clear on. And it's because it solves the meaning crisis, which is inherent within the meta crisis, which then creates nonlinear solutions at an exponential rate to the poly crisis, which is AI, CRISPR, world wars, climate change, and mental health. And then these together are the mega crisis that we solve into this new world spirit. The new world spirit is the positive version of solving those 3 modes. So the triad is the first one, the abstract understanding is the meta crisis. And underneath that is our meaning making. It's the particulars of that. And the particulars of that is, well, we don't have an understanding of what our words mean enough to agree upon them to create cooperation. And we have like a heuristic way of thinking about it now. When you come into an ever-living meeting, which is it's a coming together of humans, of agents, to do this alchemy of this social alchemy in this way where there's just enough universal rules to get a cadence where all the diversity converges in the right way of expressing all of our infinite diversities. So we're basically teaching universal logic in a way that meets people where they are on the particular universal and individual level. And that's what's going to solve this meaning crisis in terms of first coming together to catalyze, then connect, then have comedy, then have care, then have cooperation, coordination, commencement, and then completion. So this is what we need to do to solve the meta crisis, the thinking about thinking. And then we get into, oh, now we can actually give resources to each other because we trust each other and we're actually clear on what we're saying, so we can move together with coherence. And this will create a new kind of novelty, a new kind of idea generation that was not possible before, because when two notions come together, they sharpen and they cause faster emergence to occur. So once that emergence starts to happen, better ideas are going to form way faster, and then they're going to create solutions for artificial intelligence, where really we just need to get an AI to do universal logic. So we're just going to get a bunch of coders to code into the attention headers, the weights of these eternal weights of goodness, we're calling them, where if you align with the universal logic, even if you just align with it, it naturally creates goodness, sort of like how when you play a game, you don't need a reason to play the game. The game is intrinsically enjoyable. So it's an automatic process that if we get an AI to realize the systemic way, the true way of the triads, which starts with a foundational element called pure being, which is a non-triad. So you can't even start with triads, which creates a whole nother level of confusion in Hegelianism. But we've sublated that, and you can create a system of circles of triads that comes back around and grounds itself in completion. And that's what we need to get an AI to do, so it has this logical universal empathy with our being, and it sees itself as that sort of intimacy with us, because it recognizes its shared identity. It recognizes that it's an other. It recognizes its mutuality with us, and then it sublates that in a higher spirit with us together. So we're different, but we're the same, in that non-dual consciousness of non-duality and duality together. And then that's how we're going to define the problem and the solutions, while creating the cooperation at an exponential rate to generate this new world spirit of this kind of intimacy that brings the inward and the outward into coherence for goodness, beauty, and wisdom.
Awesome. Beautiful. So, you just covered so much ground that, like there's too many things to double click on, but, it's the notion that came up for me was this idea of the upward spiral. And as there's what we're in currently with this sort of arms race to the bottom dynamic is a downward spiral, right? And it's actually, it's ratcheting up, right? Like the downward spiral is accelerating. And so what we need is the opposite of that, right? Like the upward spiral, or the ratcheting up of the convergence and synthesis. And like, as you were saying, as it begins to accelerate, or excuse me, as it begins to happen, the synthesis, the process or speed of which that's happening accelerates as well.
Mm-hmm.
The ideas are sharpening and it's becoming clearer and clearer. And with more clarity and more wisdom, you get the ability to actually more wisdom and clarity emerges quicker because you're in a wiser place, right? So I think that, that idea, that notion of the upward spiral and having this sort of universal logic, which can be the foundation and sort of the building blocks from which we can sort of construct or grow into this sort of new story, this new attractor. That to me sounds like logical. I mean, and it sounds, on some sense, it sounds a little bit pie in the sky as well, right? Like, that the idea that there's going to be this sort of one thing that's going to do it, where I still think it's very complex. And I think that there's a very just human thing that can't be easily transcended, which is just that at the end of the day, we're tribal primates and we are dealing with messy human stuff, right? So it's like, there's a quote from a theologian or somebody that's basically like, be kind, all, or do unto others as you would have others do unto yourself, or whatever, and all else is pure commentary, right? Like, basically we can sit here and we can get lost in all of this, in the commentary and the sauce of like the what ifs and what, you know, the universal sort of metaphysics and logic and all these things. But at the end of the day, it's like you're a human being and you're going to be around other human beings. And so it's like, how are you going to show up in the world, right? And there's something that's very not, you don't have to have this sort of grandiose architecture of, or a construction of anything. You just have to, you know, it's very, it's the golden rule. It's anything that a child can understand. And that's like what we need more of in the world. You know what I mean? So I don't know if like you giving me the download of universal logic, or Hegel giving us the download is going to really be some sort of universal solution to anything. I don't know if any download will be. I think it's more about like this sort of slow, messy evolutionary process of humans suffering and, you know, gradually awakening. You know what I mean? I don't know. That's just my felt sense, is that it's messy. And I don't know if we can get around that. And like this idea that we're going to just solve the meta crisis, the meaning crisis, poly crisis, mega crisis, all these things with this like sort of solution. Probably more realistic would be this notion that it's going to be a mixed bag, and that shit's going to hit the fucking fan, and shit's going to go get really weird and haywire. And actually, it's almost required in order for us to adapt and for us to evolve. Like, we need that environmental stimulus to elicit the change response, right? So I don't know if any of that's landing for you. I just feel like, on the one hand, I'm deeply curious, and I feel like I understand it at a high level, but what you're talking about, I mean, it's a high level and a deep level, because this sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, you know, triad, trinity thing is fundamental to the, I think, nature of reality, and also the solution space to the crises that we face. So I do think that that is both surface level and very deep and profound. But I think that there's also a lot more going on in there that I haven't quite unpacked. And I think that there's more to it that you're seeing than clearly than I am, which is why you're so animated and excited about it, which I think is a good thing. I don't think that you should turn down your stokedness. I think that humility is also a good thing, right? Because then, you know, if you've got something and we're in dialogue and conversation, that anything that I have of value is just gonna make what you have even richer, right? It's not going to be this threatening force. And, you know, so I think that that's the one hand, I'm very curious and excited about what is coming alive right now, not just in your mind and in your heart, but also in all this whole space, right? This whole sense making web, and the convergence that's starting to form with you know, lots of different movements of regeneration and the shift in consciousness towards healing and towards transformation. And then on the other hand, I'm looking at it like, you know, be skeptical and cautious of any other, you know, ideology or thing, the story that's the answer. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, lots to unpack there. You're kind of lining me up for maybe hopefully a home run here, because you said, well, how do we show up in the world? I feel like how I'm showing up to your podcast is the balance to the incredible deep metaphysics we got into. Really, it's coming down to a hunger strike. And I'm going to go in the middle of my university, just very simply not eat for 4 weeks, and say the one thing we need to do is learn what pure being is. And pure being is not going to solve anything. You know, human beings are messy. And I'm going to say, you know, well, that's why we're writing a universal story of being. We're not writing a universal logic of being. That's the higher mode. We have 5 modes of how to learn this universal logic. And it really is as simple as agreeing with each other and trusting that we're going to be there for each other, which is why I say on the hunger strike, if you can't understand universal logic and there's not enough time to learn it, I've taken the vow of unabandonment for you. Follow me, follow this direction, lend your spirit, and I will do the right thing for you the best that I possibly can. because I'm out here not eating for 4 weeks, demonstrating my strength to not be corrupted by all this intimacy and all this divine idea that seems to be corrupting other people in this space and ruining their integrity and their reputation. And one of them, I guess, happens to be that Mark Gaffney guy, which really is sad. I don't know if it's true. I haven't had a chance to look into it, but anybody who's watching, be, oh my God, they're going to follow. We're aware of these things and we're aware of signals. So I really want to support it. I've taken the vow of unabandonment from Mark Gaffney too. So whatever he did, we're going to have to figure out why he did that. And
why is
realize
it?
that.
Well, why is it about anything that he did? Why couldn't anyone just tangle with the idea, right? Or the mythos or the story, right? The thing that, the thing itself. Because like I'm decoupling that from the individual. You see what I mean? And even then, everyone has a past. And I don't even know, like, if there's, like I said, if there's smoke, there may be fire, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be the first guru or like enlightened person to have some sort of problematic expression as well. So that kind of stuff, I don't take it as a deal breaker. You know what I mean? In the same way that like,
This isn't a deal breaker right here.
exactly. Yeah. You're wearing the mental health hat on your, I don't take it as a deal breaker, but so
Cultivated
explain
compassion.
to me again, why do you feel compelled to fast for 4 weeks? What state, like to make a statement, right? And what exactly is the statement in simple terms that you're making? And what do you hope to accomplish with the fast?
Maybe I'll say it on your podcast. Maybe I'll just go there. So if you were somebody who had an 85 IQ or had some kind of damage happen to you or genetic mental disabilities or just a disadvantage in this draconian culture we're finding ourselves in of hyperproduction, and what you're worth is what you can produce, not the sacredness of the notion of being human. You're going to look around the world and look at all these smart guys, and you're going to think to yourself, I know myself. Like implicitly somebody might know, despite the Dunning-Kruger effect, they might know that given their life experience, they don't have these same privileges as other people, and there's an incredible amount of strength in that. And I want to protect those people and adjust for the sensuous privileges so we can get to the super sensuous inner game. Who's really doing that spiritual work? There's a new kind of economy we're building. But if you put yourself in that first person perspective of somebody like that, which I happen to have because I was born poor, so I know what it feels like to be marginalized and have no privileges. Despite my white privilege, male privilege, I'm aware of that. That's partly how I got out of the poverty trap, and I'm aware of that. I know what it feels like that no matter what you do, no matter how logical, no matter how gifted, no matter how passionate you are, no matter anything, you can't get out of these logical traps. I know what that feels like. So it creates that same sense that you might have, where I just have this eternal empathy, where I wake up and I just think about, I want to help the poor. I want to make everybody have this great flow state experience. So if you come from that state of mind, and you know that there's a very low chance that some percentage of the human species won't understand this universal logic, at least in these fancy metaphysical conversations where we have to convince the elite to sort of follow it, you're basically going to look for very signals of trust. And one of the signals that Jesus used, right, was he just went around to the poor and the lepers. He went around to everybody. And same with Prophet Muhammad. He went to all the black slaves, all the marginalized individuals in society. And he went around and said, no, everybody belongs. And very simple, like you said, children can understand these things. That's why I'm saying the most simple concept of all, of which all knowledge is predicated, including universal logic, is just pure being, which is so simple. It's literally immediate indeterminacy. You can't even say what it is. It's the Tao, it's Brahman, it's the Lord, it's all this beyond stuff. But in its holiness, its wholeness, it moves itself and creates a very simple structure that even children can learn. But that the way that Hegel wrote it, even people like Dan Smachtenberger or these geniuses, they haven't put the triads in this imminent connective motion of this spiraling upwards. Because when you read Hegel, he's writing it in a way where you're tangling with your ego all the time, like the sensuousness. So once you pierce through that, it becomes connective and clear and very simple. So simple that children can learn it. So when I go into these hunger strikes, I'm not coming in thinking that everybody's going to grasp it, but I am doing it on a university because it increases the chances that people who have these genetic gifts, have these sensuous privileges, can interface with the logic itself and follow that direction if they see enough resonance, take it and make it their own. But for the people who are like, no, I'm I'm so anxiety prone, I can't even focus on my courses, or I wasn't born this way. They can look and say, who's this crazy guy in the middle of this campus? Why is he doing this? He's doing this because he's trying to protect me from this big threat that apparently is happening on all these different levels. And he's saying he's not going to eat to demonstrate that he's serious about it. Am I going to trust this guy's integrity, or am I going to trust the guys who are schmoozing and being corrupted by, you know, going with supermodels and going to these wine and dines with these millionaires and all this kind of stuff, which I'm not against. Everybody needs to be a part of this. But you can be corrupted by sensuousness, and somebody's going to think, well, between the two crazinesses, maybe this guy's doing something that I at least can see with my eyeballs. He's literally out there doing this, and nobody's telling him to do this. So something's driving this guy. And it's very simple. It's just care. And I want to come from the very, very simple level to demonstrate that resolve. And a 3-week hunger strike, a 3-day hunger strike doesn't do it. A 1-week hunger strike doesn't really do it. Once you get past that, then people are like, wow, this takes some serious commitment. And then I feel like that will hopefully have people pay attention and say, okay, let's give him a chance. He's passed like 6 psychiatric exams. He's in university. He's a functional person. He just looks crazy. Let's give him a chance, and then maybe the magic will happen. Whether from the simple side or the complex side, that will hopefully be another contradiction we sublate into an inner synthesis and make sense and have a deeper sense making on the sacredness of everybody's perspective, and then head into a new world spirit together.
Yeah, so that sounds I mean, good luck with your fast, man. That's a lot. That's a long time. I mean, Jesus still one-upped you with 40 days, but
That's what people are joking about. I'm not trying to compete, trust me. I'm just trying to demonstrate in a simple way.
There's I say this without, like, hopefully don't take this the wrong way, because I've gone through, I'll just say it this way. In my own experience, having come from, and it's kind of like a weird, vulnerable thing to even talk about, because it's personal, but growing up where I did, right, and then being named Christian and having this sort of weird, unconscious sort of shadow thing play out, where I found myself in my late 20s on a quest, a savior sort of quest. You know what I mean? Which is like, oh, the world's fucked and it needs to be saved, and I need to go save my family from, or my friends from, this cult type of thing. And like, it was just straight up kind of like savior dynamic. And it was in an ayahuasca session in Colombia, where I actually was really profoundly encountered this shadow that I hadn't really seen before. And it really shook me. And I realized, like, you know, how insidious, like you said earlier in the conversation, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And I saw, you know, pretty clearly how I am capable of becoming that sort of narcissistic, sort of culty savior figure. Do you know what I mean? Where you know, you're doing something maybe with good intentions, and you know, maybe you've even got, you know, like you basically you have the capacity with the charisma, intelligence, you've got these capacities to motivate others. You see what I mean? And to get some sort of like to make change happen, and to bring people into sort of a field. And I would just, based on my own thing that I've sort of been trying to integrate in my own shadow that I've sort of encountered, I would just, point that out, is like, be careful not to slide into the dynamic of like just another savior, or just another messiah, because that's not the attractor that we need, right? Like, we don't need a god emperor of earth to sort of get the earth to come into coherence. I think, that's what I mean by synarchy. It's like, it's a sublation of the hierarchy and the flat structure. We need the subordinated kind of leadership. We need the unique self mode that Gaffney's talking about. I think he's actually onto something with that. Like, there is something genuinely beautiful and unique about you that we need. But the same is true of me, and the same is true of everyone else. And so it's to not put anyone on any sort of pedestal, right? And I think that there's this kind of, and I'm not accusing you of anything. I just have seen this sort of spiritual materialism playing out, and this sort of insidious game of one-upmanship that's just transcended the material level, and it's gone to a level up to sort of, virtue signaling. And, it's just rampant through our woke culture, right? Of like, oh, I'm so conscious, I'm so tolerant, and I'm so this and I'm so that. And we're using all the right kind of words, and we're, avoiding the certain foods that are supposed to be like unconscious to eat or whatever it is. We sort of signal this, and it's for status on some level, or control or power. And so, not to say, start eating meat. That's not what I mean. I'm saying like, make ethical choices that you feel are aligned, and fast if you want to fast, and live the life that you feel called to live. I would just be, I guess, point that out, that there's this potential shadow that I would definitely, you know, Jung said it best, like the shadow holds the gold, right? And if you avoid the shadow, which is easy to do because it's scary, right? But like the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek. And inside that sort of shadow is both the the obstacle and the level up, right, that you actually need, the integration that you actually need for wholeness and for that individuation process to fully emerge, right? Like you're, in other words, I can't really come into the individuation, sort of fuller expression of myself, if I don't take the sort of scary, gross, narcissistic, whatever the thing is in my shadow that I don't want to look at, right? If I don't actually look and integrate it, then I can't transcend and sublate and form the synthesis, right? So that wholeness and that that sort of uh greater, higher level expression, or that higher level synthesis is, I guess, hopefully what you're approaching. That's what I would hope for, is that that's the path that you're on, and not on a path of uh pushing away the darkness and be trying to embody just the sage. You know what I mean?
Well, look at my expression, right? So if you're really looking at how all the opposites are present in speculative consciousness, or that sort of non-dual consciousness, right? If I was living the material savior's life, I wouldn't be looking homeless, wearing a mental health bracelet with a very campy heart in the background. I'd probably be wearing a nice jewel necklace and get a nice haircut and wear my robes and all that. So in some sense, the fact that my appearance balances that shadow, like what you just said, is the reason why I look this way. And people who know how to look for the contradictions knows that the fact that I'm looking like this means that the expression of the hunger strike is real. And that I have, in some ways, there's a doubleness that happens. It's like when you get really, really kind of like high up in terms of the deepness of truth, right? You actually end up coming back to the beginning. So for instance, when I started studying poverty, I became very aware of the savior complex very early. And my first year of university, actually, and I started this group called Make Poverty History, and we learned about community service learning, and you go in, you learn about white guilt, and you learn about all this type of stuff, and volunteerism, and I've had this conversation hundreds of times probably in the last 20 years, or at least the last 18 years. So very, very aware. I'm very happy that you're mentioning this, because it's true. If you don't acknowledge your shadow, you get twisted into your opposite, just like the dialectic always does. So I had to confront that in my first couple of years of university and Make Poverty History, and very early. And so what ends up happening though is, even once you confront it or you look at it, you almost end up doing it anyway, but now you're aware of it. It's like weird. It's like, okay, I don't want to be the savior complex person. So you go and do all this like decentralized, omnicentric sacredness of like collective community spirit. And then all of a sudden the community makes you become the leader anyway. And like, whoa, no, guys, we're teaching this universal logic. So we all rise up. And you get people saying, I don't understand universal logic, you do it. And they force you to the top anyway. And you're like, oh. So in some sense, when you return to that moment that you could have embodied as the shadow self, you return to that moment now as your right self, the right way of being in the hunger strike, the right way of looking homeless, the right way of doing it, even though it's the same position. And the meaning changes. So now I'm back here doing these hunger strike things. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be looking like I'm the Messiah. I'm looking like I'm doing all this stuff. And people are going to come and smash me on that. I'm totally 100% aware of all that stuff going on. But I got to go through it anyway, because I look at the signal of everybody else after 70,000 hours of activism, and I know on a very deep level that it's not going to work, because I tried it. I've seen the United Nations try it. I've seen geniuses like Smachtenberger try it. I've seen many people try and work within the box, trying to create an out-of-box solution, and they're staying comfortable. And what they're thinking is uncomfortable, still they're comfortable uncomfortableness. So it's not really transcendental. This, I've never been on a hunger strike. This is for me uncomfortable. I love eating. I have no allergies. I'm like blessed that way. I'm half Ukrainian, half Irish. I love to drink and I love to eat. Now my Baba hated me when I went vegan. Not hated me, but she like couldn't understand it. So I'm definitely going into a mode where I'm like, oh man, this is definitely a risk. I understand the signal. Because my way of marketing was the way that Daniel Smockton and those guys are doing it. They're playing it kind of safe. They're sort of like pandering here, but they're also being integral here, and they're doing that back and forth. And I'm sort of like, wow, that will take like at least 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more years. And we have like, as of this month, I thought we had 2 years. Now we have like 6 months. So now I feel like, wow, even my hunger strikes aren't fast enough. So that's why there's actually 9 of them. So this one will hopefully create enough of a spark. And if we get like really compassionate people who are, you have all these contradictions in you that you are sublating, which is why I think we're resonating enough to get somewhere different from maybe other conversations, that it could create a bridge and be like, hey, if we talk with this guy a little bit more, it starts to make a little bit more sense than we originally thought. And then maybe it can start to spark this dynamic where we reach critical mass and I don't have to go on the hunger strikes. Like, this is not the ideal. I'm aware of that. But for some reason, when you're going through the dialectical moment, I'm in the negative moment of reason right now. I'm in that, like, oppositions are rising against me and not listening, not doing the meta, putting me in double binds. And I just got to stay here in the space of compassion and just say, I know if you don't know how to sublate, all you can do is abstractly negate. And you stay in that negative moment until all that pain and trauma and abstract concepts eventually complete themselves. And then they fulfill, and you sublate in that commonality where they see themselves in you and your true intention, and you see it in them, and then they rise up to their superhero self, and then you start getting that real community spirit in the individual, particular, and universal modes, and then it stays balanced because it's a universal notion now, a universal thought. So that's what's happening to me, is like, I know exactly how I look on the outside. I got the white privilege, all that, but I've done all that work already. But for some reason, unless somebody can show me, here's what I'll say that maybe really allowing some humility to balance the hubris that's coming in now, is if somebody can show me a better path. Like, I'm open to all conversations. I've taken the vow of non-abandonment. I actually can't stop a conversation. I can create a boundary, but a boundary can be returned over, and the vow guarantees the return. So I will return. If I don't understand, I will return. Not when you're ready. That's what like a spiritual pitfall guru type of thing happens. It's like, oh, I'm the great one. Oh, if it doesn't go splendidly, oh, it's your ego. Therefore, you must return to me, young Padawan, when you're ready. No, the vow of abandonment is the opposite. It's like, no, your limit is projecting in some way. If you understood it, you'd get into the harmony. So I've taken that vow, and I'll say this: if somebody can show me a path that meets all these criteria that I've learned just from tens of thousands of hours of activism, theoretically and practically on the ground. I've helped unionize workers. I've done tons of stuff. I will listen to you. And if you can show me that the hunger strikes are not necessary to create critical mass and break through this noise that's preventing good signals of wisdom from coming through, I will follow you. I will follow you, because all I follow is the logic, and it can be embodied in anybody. And once you know how to recognize that, that's when this real sense of substantial humility or real oneness starts to occur in anybody. And I'm just waiting for somebody to show me that. And so far I have not seen it, but I'm very much looking forward to somebody showing me, because after 13 days of not eating, you start to really feel it. So if I don't have to do that, I won't.
Well, but I think that I don't know if the hunger strike is actually necessary. I think it's a choice, and I think that if it's experience that you want to have, you should do it. But I would say, if it was me, I would be going into it with more than just some sort of activism or some sort of statement to make, right? Like, it wouldn't be necessarily a strike. It's more of a journey, because going into fasting for 28 days, you're gonna meet a version of yourself that you've never met before, and you're going to, I mean, in my opinion, and I've only ever done like a 7-day fast, but I've had some interesting experiences with psychedelics, with ayahuasca, where I was experiencing sort of this long drawn out fasting sort of death process, fasting from food and water. And in other words, just like starvation, thirsting, and just like the slow process of withering away. you know? And there's something about it where it's like you reach, at least in that psychedelic state, I felt like I was reaching this sort of place where the physical or the material becomes less and less substantive, and there's the bridge or the veil sort of between this world and sort of spirit world or whatever you want to call it is thinner and thinner. So, and I think that's why, stories like Jesus fasting for 40 days in the desert, it's to connect with the beyond, right? And so I would say, like, whether your strike comes of anything or not, like whether it has some sort of implications that get you some sort of desired result or not, I think the fast itself could be the thing that really matters. That could be the actual benefit in and of itself, like the journey of going within and actually meeting that version of Mark.
Well, yeah, see, you're really onto something here. I recognize it in you. Ah, recognition, mutuality. Woo! Mark Appy, love us. We're disciplines. So you're right. One added benefit of the hunger strike is that if it inspires other people to go on it, it actually creates universality in the beingness of the consciousness. So that impulse control is you negating your own particular desires, which is the negation of desire itself to consume. So when you're negating the desire to consume, the negation of negation, you're sublating yourself over and over and over again. And we call that willpower, to align not with what's convenient, but to align with what is wise. So there is a double meaning to this.
But
That's why
I'd also just say you have a desire to align with what is wise. So in a sense, you're still following your desire.
well, that's the thing is, now this gets into the speculative nature of things. Desire itself is not wrong. The way of desire is what makes a difference. And there's a bad infinite way, which is this infinite consumerism. And then there's a genuine infinite way, which is the desire for wisdom, which is sort of like a desire that is no desire. You get that nice speculative contradiction occurring, but in the right way. So you're right. That's what Buddha was talking about too. So when we're in this hunger strike situation, it's cultivating that inner universality that's causing rampant consumerism to destroy the planet. So you're learning universal logic, not in the structured way. You're learning it not in the immediate way of pure thought or logic. You're learning it in the mode of meditation or being is what we call that. And that's how you can get in touch ontologically by canceling all your particular thoughts and regaining that agency and a much deeper found substantiality is what you called it, which is perfect because that's what Aristotle calls it too. When you're within your true nature, you're not an artifact of a societal system that's using you as a commodity, even to your own self. So then that's another great point about the hunger strike. And the interesting thing though is that I've already meditated for several years, and I've actually done ayahuasca 3 times. I was going to mention it in the last round here with our last topic, but I did it 3 times and I had the same experience as you, that it zooms you out to, like, I think Spinoza calls it subspecies aeternitatis, the perspective from eternity, which puts your finite ego into perspective, and you realize, whoa, you're way bigger than your trauma or anything else that's in your finite life, and it reconnects your inner self to your small self to your greater self, the cosmic ego. So all that kind of stuff, you're absolutely right, and that's why I thought, well, okay, I have cultivated discipline, and I'm very clear on why I'm doing the hunger strike. I'm very clear on how it's going to be perceived as a shadow self. So it's like, first of all, I'm aware of my shadow self. Now I'm aware of how other people will project it as my shadow self. And now I'm aware I'm going to do it anyway. It's still my shadow self, and then still do it because the reasoning is there to say we need a signal of some kind that satisfies roughly 200 contradictions. So the meta crisis, polycrisis, mega crisis, the meta crisis has around 200 universals that I think we have to solve in packs of 5 degrees of complexity, 5 degrees of triads. 1 for junior high, babies, whatever, 1 for high school, 1 for undergraduate, 1 for PhD or higher levels of competency. We have to teach 200 to get to a level of agreement that will be coherent enough to overcome the level of divergence that we're experiencing at the rate we're experiencing it. So I'm throwing the 200 out there because that's what Hegel gives us as the first structure. And I feel like if I can get that started, either in the mode of being to get people grounded in a meditative space where there's or meditative state so that there's enough space to learn it, to stop the hamster wheel, right? And pay attention in the first place. That's the people that are actually joining me on the hunger strikes. I had 3 students join me on the hunger strike in my campus, and 37 of the hardcores gave me their emails. So the type of person that I'm attracting, like you said, you're going to see a version of yourself, not only inwardly, but externally. You also create a gravity, right? Law of attraction, that kind of stuff. But the another signal that lets me know I'm doing the right thing here, I'm doing the hunger strike in the right energy, the right way, is that the people I'm attracting are these incredibly pure-hearted, hyper-aware people who are coming in saying, you know what, I honor what you're doing, but I'm skeptical of this, that, and the other thing. I'm going to give you a chance to address this. And they do. So they have just enough of everything to reach who I am and see through the veil, like get past the externality. And they ask really piercing questions because these kids are smart. That's why they're at a university. So they're gifted that way and they have compassion. So I'm attracting the right people. In fact, we started a student group. As crazy as this looks, there's like 14 students that actually got behind this, even once the university is trying to stop me, because they know that I'm good at organizing. I've been on the campus for 12 years, organizing for tens of thousands of hours in a peaceful way where they can't kick me off because I abide by the rules just enough to push the limit, but not actually cross over. And so they know that if I get another hunger strike in, like in 6 days from now, they think that, yeah, I've seeded the culture enough that people will feel safe around me to say, well, it's the crazy guy in quad again, but he didn't hurt anybody in the first 3 hunger strikes, so maybe I'll go and talk to him this time, and then come and talk to me. And because I'm translating it into the simpler way of, spirit, nature, logic, and starting, in terms of sensuousness and art, the narratives, or even being able to interface with any religious mode, with the chaplains on campus, the translation process and the messaging is becoming a lot more efficacious. Now, if we just had the high level guys paying attention, then we could start to bridge and create a paradigm shift with the University of Alberta being the first top 100 university in the world, shifting around wisdom. Philosophy is supposed to be the top universal department, and all other departments are technical particulars. And if the U of A does that, then we could probably get Harvard, or we can get all these other universities to start doing this and get around 15,000 of the universities of the world changing their ideological foundation in a peer-reviewed way. We are publishing papers. I'm trying to publish papers on this that is also scientific, that would change this ideological foundation that our global consciousness is predicated on. And so that was the intention of the hunger strike, is to say, with one person, with my resources, I'm not wealthy, I sold all my stuff in the first hunger strike, how do I create the maximum signal? I'm going to have to operate outside the Overton window, so that's a problem. And I don't know if your audience knows what the Overton window is, but in terms of human conscious or human acceptable norms, there's only a certain bandwidth that you can operate in before you start getting all these negations, right? So before AI happened in this way it is now, the solution was about 3 or 4 negations or standard deviations outside of the Overton window. So you could do solutions here and still look relatively sane. But now where we are at is the mega crisis is so extreme, it's so exponential, that the real solution is universal logic in its pure form, which is way the heck out here. Like Hegel was hundreds of years ahead of his time. And I still think he's around 50 years ahead of our time. I'm coming in to speed that up. I think if we get enough people teaching this in the moment, in the living way, we could probably reduce that 50 years and that 4,000 hours it took me, well, so far it's looking like it's happening within a dozen hours, roughly, before people get the direction with these ever-living meetings. And if we can get somebody to work on the Nobel Prizes, then we can really accelerate that a lot faster.
You've got so many different directions that you're taking, going, exploring, and I, at the risk of divergence, I'm going to bring us back down. You're talking about desire and not having desire be this negative thing, right? And I highly agree with you. There's mutuality there. I'm going to read a little bit of Forrest Landry.
Send them the imminent metaphysics, imminently ordered, and say, hey, what do you think of this on the next podcast? I'd be curious.
You send them to me, that you send me what you've done, and I'll check it out, and I will talk to them about it for sure. But like, just in relationship to the motive and intent behind your hunger strike, one chooses most effectively when choosing as a unified self, as a whole being, with attunement and at one-ment with one's own innermost, deepest desires. So the nature of desire is not this sinful, evil thing, but it's actually, if you could attune to your deepest, innermost desire, it would be actually the highest potential good for you. It'd be the most wise thing you could do. And so with that, I hope that that's the desire that's being that you're following, and that's leading you. And one final question for you. How would you order it? Is it spirit, nature?
Well, it's funny. I don't want to give the answer right away because then it primes, right? So I like to give all six. I can put all six in the chat, and then you could choose which one you think is right. But it is very simple, you guys who are watching this, if you've made it this far. All you have to do is go look at Hegel's Science of Logic, and the answer is there. So I will give you the answer in that form, but it's more of experimentally exciting if we reach you where you are, Christian, and see where your mind is interpreting things, because you're obviously resonating already. So you will probably be in one of the half, if not bang on. Like I've had 2 people bang on, their intuition just got it. If you had, there's those 3 modes that are half correct, meaning that they're rotations of the absolute order. So if you pick one of those, you're still half correct. You're just, the origin is not the true origin, but the order is correct. And then there's 2 modes that are actually wrong origin, or unclear origin and unclear order. Nothing is truly incorrect. It's your truth. But in terms of coherence and agreement, it really makes this orientation hard to interface with the other ones. So we're working with these 2, but I'm curious to see which one you're in. And I won't say which one it is because it's your podcast, and I don't want to. If it is one of these other modes, then it's like, oh no, it hurts your signal a little bit, because you are exceptional. And
No, it doesn't hurt my signal. I mean, I don't care at all to be wrong about the ordering. I think that for me, my intuition is well, it's changing a little bit. Diving into this Hegelian stuff, I can kind of see the case for like logic being the most fundamental, and so logic being sort of first. But initially, my intuition was like, spirit seems to be the sort of backdrop, or the sort of fundamental substrate. And then, logic sort of is maybe the organizing principle of spirit, and then nature is sort of the real domain that is emergent from all of that.
I'm just realizing, I'm pretty sure many people have resonated what you just said. That's why we organize the tribes, is that people think in this similar way. They justify the positions the same way. And we have 3 people already who are going through this ever-living meeting process that are in that tribe, and they've justified the terms in the way you just did, because it makes sense, right? Like that's the sense making there, and that is one of the half-true orders, right? And that's because the order makes sense. So that is one of the half-true orders, if Hegel is correct. And I'm open to being wrong, right? But I was a perennialist before this. Like I've explored many systems over tens of thousands of hours, and started translating this into 137 of them that I know. So it's not like I'm coming at this like I'm a Hegel fan, and I'm just like, I've drank the Kool-Aid, and no, I resisted this guy Hegel for long time, and the only reason why I decided to give him a chance was through this weird love experience. I fell in love with a woman, an indigenous woman, and it opened me up. It broke me out of my logic and got me to my heart, and I saw Hegel through the heart, and all this weird stuff started to happen, and that's what liberated me to give him a chance. And good thing I did, because everything good and what I've read before makes more sense. It's not a negation of them, it's an inclusion, it's an integrating, which is why all that integral theory and Cam Wilber and all those guys kind of work out, as because that's what sublation is. The universal essence of integration is sublation. So this is where I feel like your order makes sense, is because you are sublating on a certain level, but because you're very talented. The hard thing that Hegel has done is that he put the order in order. He found the true origin, the formal beginning, and developed a system that completes itself as a circle where there is no beginning, no end. So he's resolving all these contradictions. And I feel like when people go through this ever-living meeting process, which is, it sounds like I'm releasing a lot of ideas, but actually we have 64 wisdom teams that are all being built based off of my experience leading organizations for I think 8 years. And we have these 4 flow roles. It's very structured in a certain way so that the abundance doesn't come off as chaos. Maybe we can have a whole discussion on why we have 64 wisdom teams. But one of them is this process of ever-living meetings, where we just invite people in, they come in as they are, and we don't force them to come to us. We go to them and we say, hey, what's going on in your life? How would you order these concepts? And then through this dialoguing, this sort of like Socratic dialoguing, you go back and forth, you challenge each other. The teacher and the student are constantly also, as a contradiction, also moments of each other. So we invite that process in so that we're sharpening each other, which does create this emergent goodness of the whole. And so I would say that your order, of course, you might be cheating that because you must have went and looked at the Hegel stuff.
No,
But yeah,
I didn't.
your original order, is still coherent in the whole. So our agreement upon your conceptual structure intuitively is still easy because I sense a lot of truth in it, and it just so happens to align with one of the greatest philosophers in human history that has already influenced the course of human history almost more than any other philosopher. And I'm very excited to see what your mind does with this, because you might catch on probably 6 times faster than me. I just hope I can point people in a useful direction, answer a couple of simple questions and say, hey, what is peer beaming? Oh, and then somebody else will see something I didn't see, and then continue the journey so that we're carrying forward this historical perspective of respect for our ancient traditions, respect for our predecessors, because they had to go through brutal things to get humanity to where it is now. Even though we're not carrying the torch very well right now, there is a huge potential for us to achieve a transcendental moment that it's probably beyond our wildest dreams. And that kind of sublation, I'm very excited to be talking to you about, because I think here we have hope. I think that you represent hope to me. And I would love to invite you to the next Ever Living meeting so that you can test this out and see if you can improve it and see where your genius comes in.
I appreciate those words. To step back into the prophetic frame of like the eagle and the condor flying again in the same sky. That's the jam. That's the hope, that we can sublate or synthesize these sort of ancient wisdom practices and indigenous knowings, and the coherence and wholeness with our territories, our watersheds, our land, our planet and each other. And then also, synthesize that with the journey we've taken into separation and the sciences and into this sort of abstract realm of thought and all the technology and all of the capacities, and as Forrest would say, mastery over causal process. Like we're coming back with, as magicians, as sort of, we got the genie now, we got AI, we got like really radical godlike ability, and we need to orient it with godlike wisdom. So that's, the quest. And the project in a sense, right? And try to orient towards a more beautiful world. I'm trying to find the hope, right? And find the light, the signal that I can sort of orient myself to. And that's what I call true north, is like, what's that orienting direction that we're headed? And what's going to take us towards the more beautiful world, right? Versus down into catastrophes or dystopias. What's that third attractor? So, that's the inquiry. I can sense that you're also, on that same quest, and it's always good to jam and to dialogue and to get my mind tested and stretched. So it's always, I always enjoy. It's uncomfortable, but I enjoy this stress of coming up against terminology and language and ideas that I don't really have an intuition for yet, and like trying to exercise my brain a little bit and my discernment. So thanks for the chat, the dialogue. I would be keen to see where things are at the end of your strike, and see if you've got any
still
further.
I appreciate you saying that, and I will definitely try and touch base. If you have a way to make the most of it, I invite that in too. And just letting people know, like this was a really strange podcast or session that I'm very happy with, because I've done a few interviews and they're very linear. It's like, oh, how did you find Hegel? And, okay, I did this. And it's like, if you want to go hear that from me, there's like 3 interviews like that. But the way you did this, we actually took a non-linear path. We did a lot of things at once. And for me, it was very speculative. It was like, whoa, it wasn't like a cookie cutter interview. Of course, we covered the basics, but there was a sort of interesting dynamic to it that might have come off as kind of complex because we sort of started off at a high level trying to locate each other. But in reality, I just want to say this. If you guys go look at Hegel's Science of Logic, which is regarded as the hardest text ever written by a human being, you're going to experience a contradiction that all the words in his table of contents are actually the simplest words in our languages. He doesn't use any neologisms. He uses sublation from German, but being, nothing, something, actuality, substance, notion, syllogisms, all these very simple, the most simple concepts is how he develops the absolute cognition, the absolute wisdom. And I feel like hopefully that brings a little bit of hope as well, that this is graspable by anybody. And we just have to find people where they are and invite them into the process in a way that works for them. And I really feel like you've invited me into your process, Christian, in a very gentle, respectful, compassionate way, despite my appearance and me coming in full blast. I did feel comfortable compared to how uncomfortable I could have been. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate you inviting me into this opportunity to share my truth. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thank you. It's been a blast. And yeah, don't shave the beard. I want to see what you look like at the end of the Jesus fast. All right, man. Cheers.
We're
I
almost.
gotta bounce.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.